I acknowledge that Carleton University, which has been integral to hosting this conference, is located on unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. This conference was made possible thanks to the Young Minds Grant provided by the Canadian Department of National Defense and the help of the CDSN. Today, we will be discussing the emerging bipolar system in international relations between China and the United States, as well as Canada's place. There have been many recent and ongoing developments that prompted me to feel this topic was a pressing issue in today's world, and that we should be discussing Canada's role and its foreign policy options. Developments such as the situation with the two Michaels, the US-China trade war, China's Belt and Road Project, the situation around Taiwan, etc. Now, for this conference, there will be 3 panels: the decline of American hegemony, China's current foreign policy tactics, which will start at 2:15 p.m., and the third panel, which is Canadian foreign policy options and the aftermath of the AUKUS agreement, which will begin at 3:30. We have great speakers lined up for each panel. The way this will work is that each speaker will present their topic with slides that will be both shown in French and English, depending on the live stream you choose. After all the speakers have presented, there will be time for questions, and we encourage everyone to engage with our presenters. If you have any questions, feel free to start typing them in the chat as soon as you have them. Remember that there's both an English live stream and a French live stream so that you can choose to watch the one you prefer. For panel 1, we will have Dr. Elizabeth Freund from the University of Mary Washington speaking, followed by Dr. Bob Murray from the McDonald-Laurier Institute, and then Dr. Thomas Christensen from Columbia University. Also, for our speakers, for those with PowerPoints, when you're ready to move on, just say next slide. Our AV team is also able to go back to a certain slide if you want, both during your presentation and the question period. Without further ado, I will let Dr. Elizabeth Freund take the stage with her presentation, American Hegemony and Risen China. Dr. Elizabeth Freund is the professor of political science and international affairs at University of Mary Washington in Virginia, United States, and president of Larus Consulting, LLC. She's an expert with decades of experience researching and analyzing the domestic politics and foreign relations of Taiwan, China, and Japan. Her areas of interest include the cross-strait relations, maritime security issues in the Asia Pacific, and US foreign policy in East Asia. She's currently conducting research on US naval diplomacy in the Asia Pacific. Dr. Elizabeth Larus, you now have the stage.
Thank you very much for having me here today. All right, so as you can see from the title slide, the title of my presentation today is actually American Hegemony and Risen China. This is not a typo here, so you can guess my thesis. It questions if America is actually in decline. Certainly, you probably know that China, since the US pulled out of the Vietnam War, has considered the United States to be a wounded hegemon. However, international events since then have made China's leaders reassess. For example, the US performance in the Gulf War in 1990-91, the US performance as part of NATO during the Balkan Wars, etc., where the United States continually surprises China. So China still believes that the United States is a wounded hegemon, but maybe not so wounded, and its decline is going to be gradual and take longer than the Chinese leadership anticipated. So now let's go to what would be the first of the text slides, titled China Rise, US Decline. Okay, so here you can read a quote from Michael Beckley and Hal Brands from an article that they wrote in Foreign Affairs just in October of 21, and that there's plenty of evidence to support China's view that the United States is a wounded hegemon and that it is a power in decline. And in particular, the debacle of US withdrawal from Afghanistan only supported that view that the United States is a wounded hegemon. It's not the power that it used to be. So let's go to the next slide, US decline. Okay, so here I just bullet pointed some examples instances that we could draw and say, yeah, the US is in decline. That supports that thesis. By the way, this presentation is not exhaustive. We could certainly have a lot of discussion later about US decline, China's rise. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Afghanistan, there was no way to describe it other than a debacle. That withdrawal was a mess, and it looked, the United States looked very bad. But you probably know that the US society is not, in harmony right now. Drugs are a huge problem. Crime is a problem. I'm sure you saw the protests in 2020 and 21. US economy, we have huge inflation problems going into stagflation. 20% of economists now are saying we're headed for a recession. Okay, and then we do have a shrinking military. The United States, yes, we are around the world 24/7, 365 days a year, but with fewer troops, and it is becoming harder to recruit military, troops for our military. And then US diplomacy has been lacking in Southeast Asia and in Europe. And so these are all things that certainly the CCP can point to as evidence of US decline. So the next slide is titled, "Is China a risen power?" Notice I use the term risen, not a rising power. This is a thesis that you may have seen thrown around recently, and I think it is a very interesting one. Okay, and you can read, "We have often heard of America's decline, China's rise, but has China plateaued?" Okay, so the question that I'm asking today and I seek to answer is, has China actually peaked? Is it still rising, or has it risen? Next slide, please. This is peak China scholarship. Okay, so Beckley and Brands in that Foreign Affairs article argue with some evidence that they present that China has peaked. It has plateaued. It was not going to rise further. Okay, and so I just, for academics there, I listed, a couple of scholars, one other than myself, that had published actually several years ago on this topic. Salvatore Babones had published in, again, Foreign Affairs, but we're talking, let me see, what is that, like 11 years ago, Middling China. And his thesis, his argument was that China would grow old before it joined the Club of Rich Nations. And then he came back with a book called American Tianxia, which is a response to that idea of China Tianxia, all under heaven, that the United States would still continue to be the dominant power worldwide. And then also I published a textbook, two editions, where I also, discuss this thesis that maybe China is not going to continue to rise so much. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, elements of national power. Students will recognize these elements of national power from particularly Morgenthau, but also Organsky, Kumar, Palmer and Perkins, and other scholars. And so this is how I am evaluating elements of China and US national power. So let's go through these because I know there's very limited time. Okay, so next slide, please. Natural resources and agriculture. I don't have to tell you China's problems with, not just air pollution. We know smog, we know fog, but actually China's worst environmental problem is actually water. And China's rivers are drying up as well. So most of China's water is undrinkable. It is unsuitable for life forms. It's also drying up. It's being used to irrigate farms. So it's polluting farms, it's polluting produce. And then also China can possibly looking at a problem of food scarcity. China does not get as much wheat and grains from the Ukraine as Egypt, Turkey, the Middle East, and Africa. But with that shortage, there is going to be tremendous demand for grains. Okay, so the pollution problems, which is a natural resource issue, can really hurt China and prevent it from rising so much more. The next slide, please. Population and demographics. Again, I don't have to tell you this, okay? China is becoming old before becoming rich. Right now, China is classified, that is, the World Bank classifies China as a middle income country. To enter the rich category, per capita income needs to be about 13,000. China's close, about 12,000 and some change. Okay, but they're not there. Look at that demographic pyramid. Look at China in 2018 is on the far left, And then on the China graph there, China 2050 is that right, you can't even call it a pyramid. What is that, a stupa? You can see, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see where this is going. It is becoming old. All right, so now look at the United States. The United States is aging too. Look at 1960 and then 2060. Ooh, we're going to be in trouble in 2060. However, we're already rich. We are already there. When you look at the NICs, remember those, the newly industrialized countries from the 60s, 70s, 80s, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they were, and then Japan before that, they were able to become rich because their demographics, their populations were growing. They had much younger populations than China has now. So, population is not just mouths to feed, but it's human capital. If you do not have, increasing human capital, the young people, then that's going to hold the economy back some. Next slide, please. Dimensions of power. Let's look at economic power. Look at the United States and China. China's the world's second largest economy. Wow, after 30 years of double-digit economic growth, they are the world's second largest economy. However, there is a big difference between $22 trillion and 17.5. It's in my mind, or isn't that kind of about the same? But when it comes to actual dollars, there's a big difference. Now, the really big difference is the GDP per capita. Look at the United States, 69,000. That number actually surprises me, to be honest. But okay, per capita income, and again, it's a statistic, okay? But it's 69,000, almost 70,000. But look at China, it's 12,000 because of the huge population. China is thriving on trade. That is a very good dimension for China. But its debt is very big, okay? It's 270% of GDP. Wow, gotta get a grip there. Okay, now it is bringing in a lot of FDI, but not as much as the United States. At one point, China was bringing in more FDI than the United States, not recently, partly because of COVID, because of the way it's standing with Russia, in this Ukraine war, for a lot of reasons. It's not drawing in as much. Okay, the COVID lockdowns, I don't have to tell you, is going to take a toll on the Chinese economy. And right now, I do not anticipate Xi Jinping will drop the zero COVID policy before the 20th Party Congress, which meets in 20th Party Congress, which will be held in Beijing in October. He has staked his reputation on that zero COVID policy. He's not dropping that, so it will have an effect on the economy. Whereas the US, yes, we have 1 million people dead from COVID. The economy is kind of slow, but it's growing. Yeah. Hopefully. Jury's out on that one. Bring it back to that one. Okay, military power. The United States global firepower rank is #1. Then Russia's #2, largely because of the number of nuclear weapons that it has. And China ranks #3, not too shabby, right? This is where China can really shine in its military power. China has the largest navy in the world, the largest military now in the world. However, it does not have that presence 365 days a year, 24/7 around the world. Also, the United States has alliances. We've scared them a few times, with our commitments, but we do have alliances. China has like an agreement with North Korea. It's not a true military mutual defense alliance. It has no true military defense alliances. And we're going to see this as being extremely important for China if it continues to claim South China Sea and the Western Pacific. Let's go on to the next slide. Military power, which is continued. Now, the base of new military, the pace of new military base construction in the Asia Pacific has been noteworthy because China is militarizing the Asia Pacific. Yeah, the United States already did it, right? We did that after World War II. That's why we've been the dominant power in the region, but we're not building new bases there. Matter of fact, we are, we lost Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base from the Philippines in the 1990s. So we actually have fewer bases there. Yeah, we've got that rotational Marine group, up in Northern Australia, but that's about 2,000 Marines on a rotational basis with some increases now and again. Okay, and so China, and out in Solomon Islands, signed an agreement, and so we'll see if there are bases, coming from there. Cambodia, there might be a base there. Okay, so that's a dimension definitely to watch. Geography. The United States has been blessed with geography. We have Canada next door, the gentle giant. We have no problem with Canada. Mexico, another great country on our southern border. And then we've got two oceans. We're so lucky. China has, oh my gosh, I don't know, last count, like 18 neighbors. It has pacified its boundaries, I should say. Its relations with most of its neighbors is peaceful, much more than it was during the Cold War. However, it does have a lot of neighbors, and a lot of neighbors that are friendly to the United States. So if China wants to expand its presence, it's going to bump into a lot of countries that are allied with the United States. And again, the United States still has a presence there. So the more that it pushes its claims in the South China Sea, is it driving China's maritime neighbors closer to the United States? I don't think a lot of, particularly the ASEAN countries, are going to enter formal alliances with the United States, but it might tilt them more towards the United States. One country, of course, to watch now is the Philippines, with President-elect Marcos coming in. He appears to want to have better relations with China, but also wants to maintain relations, of course, with the United States. Next slide, please. Diplomacy. Okay. The United States, I think the United States could have done better with its diplomacy in the last 6 years. But China has tried this wolf warrior diplomacy. That term comes from the movie Wolf Warrior, which was a smash hit in China. This to me is reminiscent of the 1980s. Remember that book that came out, The Japan That Can Say No? China is saying, you can't just keep wagging your finger at us. But China did it in what was received as an acerbic way. And that made people skittish of Chinese diplomats and what Chinese diplomats are saying. You can see Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian, I'm sure we're quite familiar with him. He is very blunt in his response, and it has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, partly because they're just not used to this, but also these wolf warrior tactics. It takes a very, very sharp tone. And again, China is trying to get its story out, saying that the West does not portray the China story fairly. And so this has driven, Europe to be, somewhat skittish of China and back over perhaps more to the United States. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're getting down to government and leadership. I think China actually has a very good hand here. China has, as we know, a centralized government. It is stable. It is consistent. The Communist Party's policies actually have been very consistent over the decades. Yeah, there's been reform and opening, and there's been a lot of, changes. But if you look at the policies, you look at the party itself, they've been very, very consistent over the year. A centralized government can more easily not only initiate policies, but implement them. The United States, we have different presidents every, 8, possibly 4 years. I'm sure that's very confusing to the rest of the world. And they come in with different policies. This appears very erratic. It is hard for a centralized government to understand American democracy. It's difficult for Americans to understand American democracy. So this is very confusing. And also, American policy can then be very erratic. And you have seen American democracy be very messy. And that's a polite way of putting it. And so as a result, there is this inconsistency in policy. There are policy lags. Our political institutions as of this moment are still strong democratically. However, a lot of Americans have lost a lot of faith in our political institutions. That is a problem when your citizens lose faith in political institutions. As far as we know, there still is a lot of public support for the government. We are aware of protests in Shanghai and other places on the zero COVID policy. However, overall, the leadership, the public appears to support the leadership. Okay, let's move on. So the next slide I'm trying to get to is soft power. I think the United States still runs away with the soft power if I would compare it to China. Most countries, most people around the world, not all, admire American democracy, our human rights, look at immigration patterns. A lot of people, if they have a choice where to, emigrate from that country and immigrate to, it is still the United States. It is the top country when people are polled if they can respond wherever they want to go. China did a very good job with the, the Confucian values, resurrecting the Confucian values and the Confucius Institutes. A lot of those are closing in the United States, but they're expanding in other countries, particularly in the less developed countries where China can have a lot of influence. China, we know, is an economic success story without being a democracy. So if you want a centralized government, an authoritarian government, you can look to China as a very good model. China was gaining a lot of admiration, I would say, up until, the three things, until reports came out about China's treatment of Uyghurs, out in the Northwest in Xinjiang province. Also, Hong Kong shutting down the protests there and implementation of the national security law. And then the third one that I think probably had the most impact was COVID, not coming out and coming out, first of all, and saying we've got this SARS-like thing going around, and then second, denying that it was humanly transmissible and time was lost there, and then not being open when WHO, sent over a delegation. So China lost a lot of mileage there, and now I'm not saying that China is siding with Russia, because actually China has done a number of things to support Ukraine, but publicly it has not denounced the Russian leadership and it never talks about a Russian invasion, into Ukraine. So they're losing some admiration that they had actually gotten before. And then the Wolf Warrior diplomacy isn't helping a lot. Okay, next slide. I know this is teeny weeny. Maybe you can, make it bigger on your computers. But again, this is, hey, here's proof. Okay, that if people have a choice, they want to come to the United States, Germany. Hey, look at Canada, number 3 there. Okay, because everyone loves Canada, right? All right. So finally, views of China again. Just some empirical evidence to say that now, like. It's not just the United States, but a lot of people in the developed world, right? You can see a lot of these countries in the developed world, unfortunately for China, have a negative view of China. This is very different than from about 5 years ago. Most of these countries about 5 years ago, had a very good impression of China. Okay, and then to wrap up. Well, you can read, right? And of course, I'm an American. I try not to be biased in my research, but, what I found in doing this and looking at, your national elements of national power, the U.S. economy is still number 1. It's still a democracy, despite the problems that we have had. Our global firepower is still number 1, even though we have, it appears to be a shrinking military. We still have the alliances. We need to strengthen those. And we still have diplomacy, not just our State Department, but also through NATO. And we do have good relations now with NATO and with the European Union, which is extremely important. China is strong. Is it going to get stronger? It's the world's number 2 economy, GDP wise. Sure, it could grow larger than the US's, but not on a per capita basis, right? World's number 3 military. Let's see the next few months, couple of years, how Russia comes out of this conflict, okay? China could replace Russia as number 2 in terms of global firepower. It's number 1 in population, but India will soon exceed the population, China's population, will decrease. What China has going for it, though, is phenomenal technology, innovation, and manufacturing are world class. They will probably, with a shrinking population, move more toward automation, robotics, and China's very good at that. So the jury is still out on this. I'm just not convinced that China will continue to rise. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative, and we're so happy that you could come. And now we will have Dr. Bob Murray with his presentation, Canada and the New World Order, Opportunities and Challenges. One of North America's leading authorities on public policy and politics, Bob Murray serves as Senior Advisor at the Don Laurier Institute. In his thriving practice, Bob counsels public sector and private sector organizations from a wide range of industries on strategic development and planning, organizational change, crisis and issues management, policy analysis and development, labor relations and collective bargaining, risk analysis and mitigation, and governance and government affairs within Canada and globally. Dr. Bob Murray, I will let you have the stage.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Safia, thanks again for the invitation, and also thanks to the CDSN folks for supporting and putting this together today. Pleasure to be talking with you today. And I'm in the middle of between two fantastic speakers. My question that I'm going to deal with primarily is that question that was driving the conference, which is, where does Canada fit in this rivalry, and what are we going to be looking at in Canadian foreign policy moving forward to be able to help navigate these changes in world order, and also this complex relationship between China and the US moving forward. And so I think one of the things that I started with in thinking about this, and that I always start with, is what do we actually trace back in Canadian foreign policy to help understand how we're operating right now and the options that are available to us. Building on Elizabeth's presentation, and we're looking at taking a look at the capabilities and power of two major powers moving forward. Canada does not exactly square up in those areas when we're looking at how Canada would fit into that very complex relationship. And so getting into that next slide, please. Starting with the last time that there was a bipolar structure, what did Canada look like on the world stage? How did Canada behave internationally, and what were the ways that it actually pursued its goals and interests that we might be able to learn from, and looking at the way the world is going to operate moving forward? And so one of the primary concerns for Canada in the last iteration of bipolarity, and of course, which was the Cold War, was this idea of how to forge an independent path in a bipolar structure while also enjoying the constant protection of the US as a superpower. And so Canada was always interested in making sure that it had an independent foreign policy. I think there's a lot that assume that Canada's foreign policy during the Cold War and bipolarity simply just followed the US. And we know that's not true. We know that Canadian policymakers coming out of World War II, the early days of the Cold War and throughout, were incredibly preoccupied with trying to figure out how it was that Canada was going to be able to forge a level of independent foreign policy while making, of course, its strategic alignments very clear as being with the US. So born out of that, of course, is the famous concept that really Canada helped define, and that has been built on for many years, and now we're seeing employed by a number of countries throughout the world, which is middle powermanship. So we know that Canada was not a great power, not a minor power, and so the challenge was, and the challenge really remains, how to find space to operate in a very complex international system through the political, diplomatic, and economic capabilities that Canada has, all of which rank very high on the international stage, without the harder military power. And while we can rely through certain alliances on the US for that level of protection to augment our hard power limitations in Canada, the idea of this middle powermanship and the decision to go and to pursue a path as a middle power throughout the bipolar structure of the Cold War provided Canada with unique opportunities. And I think what we've seen is those unique opportunities and the identity that was formed throughout the Cold War for Canada as a middle power has remained constant in the culture and perceptions and narratives around Canadian foreign policy. We've seen recent studies done that say that most Canadians still accept in this idea of middle powermanship resonates with Canadians as to how our foreign policy actually operates and the place that we occupy in the world. And Canadians largely assume that we're doing the same things now that we were doing 50 years ago when it comes to our foreign policy, despite a number of different changes. So also through that concept of middle powermanship, there were really two elements that were interesting that I think are going to become relevant again and have been relevant in Canadian foreign policy throughout the last number of years. This idea of a twofold strategy of protection and projection, as I call it. Protection, of course, of national security and self-interest. Naturally, we saw the security environment of the Cold War meant that that idea of national security was of the utmost importance, and we saw where the alliances and allegiances for Canada were as to how to go about pursuing that idea of national interest and national security. But then there was also this element of projection, where we were talking a lot about values and norms. And those values and norms included things like peacekeeping, things like anti-landmine treaties, and pushing forward on a number of different normative concepts that we saw even the US was not interested in talking about throughout the Cold War, because we were able to talk about it differently. But more importantly, we occupied a unique space in that we were able as Canada to talk about these things and project norms because we had absolutely no expectation whatsoever we were going to be able to enforce them. And so this idea that we were able to actually raise ideas and to convene forums to talk about ideas in a very safe way that we knew that others were going to come to the table. And this idea of a convener was even mentioned recently in Canadian foreign policy by the Foreign Affairs Minister as to how it is, Global Affairs Minister, excuse me, as to how we're doing business in the world. And of course, in terms of how to go about pursuing this idea of protection and projection, the primary tactic of our foreign policy advancement was multilateralism. And again, so the use of formal alliances like the UN and NATO, et cetera, but also informal diplomatic alliances and multilateral alliances to be able to advance our national interests. And our foreign policy is largely known for the use of multilateralism. And there's a significant amount of work that has been done on how multilateralism actually became the cornerstone of how we pursued middle powermanship, not just during the Cold War, but since. And of course, moving to the next slide, please, when we look at what happened at the end of the Cold War and we enter the unipolar moment where we have the US as a hegemon, we see Canada more closely aligned with the US on a number of different fronts. We certainly saw in 2001 working with NATO and going to Afghanistan. But overall, the relationship between Canada and the US when it comes to foreign policy sees a great deal of alignment over ideas and actions. The notable exception, of course, being the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where Canada decided not to pursue the invasion, primarily under the auspice of it being a violation of international law and outside the approval of the multilateral institutions that Canada holds so dear in pursuing its foreign policy. One of the other pieces, of course, is that because we had a unipolar moment driven by the US, having a Western hegemon allowed for Western norms to become more central in foreign policy making. Whether they actually translated into practice, I don't think we have enough time to move through that full debate, but things like human security in particular, and this idea of transitioning from peacekeeping to peace building. We saw a lot of that conversation as to how that was going to take place and how that reflected Western norms, and it, exemplified in some ways through the responsibility to protect doctrine starting in 2001 and adopted by the UN in 2005. The growth in free trade and free trade regimes, free trade becoming an intrinsic good for us to be able to pursue with allies in other countries and other alliances to be able to push those Western norms throughout the international system. Throughout the unipolar moment, of course, multilateralism remained central as our means of enacting foreign policy. Though our role in formal institutions began to change, we saw that, again, that transition into talking a lot more about peace building, interventionism. We talked a little bit about Afghanistan, looking at the no-fly zone in Libya as well, for instance, and more coalitions of the willing, taking a look at how the role that we were playing in some of those variables and some of those events, and also how it was that we were using multilateralism. I think the character of multilateralism changed. It allowed us far more freely to operate, knowing that there was that strategic alignment with the US normatively, and that the US was going to be able to project itself more freely than certainly it was during the Cold War. But ultimately, I would say that during the unipolar moment, one of the defining factors of Canadian foreign policy is we became lazy. We became incredibly apathetic in our foreign policy. And I think a lot of this had to do with our proximity and relationship with the US, meaning that we didn't have to try as hard. What allowed Canada to navigate the Cold War years successfully in its foreign policy in many ways was this idea that we were deliberately forging a path through a middle power type mentality and very strategically using our place in the world to try to pursue national interests as well as more global interests. It was deliberate, given the security environment and given the interest in having a more independent foreign policy from the US at times, meant we really had to put a significant amount of effort into forging that foreign policy. There was a clearer vision. We saw work done, certainly in the onset of the Cold War, around what type of role Canada was going to occupy in the world, and the strategy followed from that vision. In the unipolar moment is really the beginning of the turn in Canadian foreign policy to a lot of talk without the requisite action to be able to reinforce it. And that laziness has really started to crept into Canadian foreign policy and is something that has continued to endure as we look forward on Canadian foreign policy. So moving to the next slide, when we're talking about the evolution in world order, and it's particularly how to start dealing with whether it's a rising or risen power in China, referring back to Elizabeth's take in her presentation, one of the things that we know right now in the limitations is Canada does not have an international strategy. We have a lack of clarity around goals, interests, tactics, and preferences for foreign policy. We know we want to do stuff, and we hear a lot about wanting to do stuff. We know that we stand for a lot of the things that the U.S. stands for, particularly when the U.S. informs us that we're going to need to stand for those things in line with the U.S., but not having a very clear international strategy limits our ability to actually function in an evolving world order. And that shift toward a rhetorical foreign policy without consistent action or a consistent plan, vision, real policy initiatives really has led other states to take us less seriously. The idea that Canada would lose its bid for a UN Security Council seat, mainly because we didn't take the campaign for that Security Council seat terribly seriously. Other countries did and were more successful. And so I think we've reached this point in Canadian foreign policy where there's a unique challenge for us to have to think through as the US and China rivalry continues to grow and continues to evolve. And the rise of a non-Western great power like China poses a unique challenge for Canada. How to engage China constructively as Canada independently while not automatically being seen as a U.S. proxy. If we revert back to that Cold War strategy and bipolarity, that independence allowed Canada to navigate very clearly. We're not as independent as we were. As I said, we got lazy during the unipolar moment. We went along with the U.S. a heck of a lot more. So now that we have a different international structure, and how are we going to engage is going to be interesting for Canada to have to navigate. So what we know is that the return of bipolarity and the ongoing evolution of bipolarity has not been met with strategies that are going to make us successful in a bipolar structure. And really, even our cornerstone of multilateralism, we've started to become laggards in our multilateral institutions, that we're willing to talk through issues, but our contributions and lending to these institutions, to missions, to initiatives has been in decline and being questioned by other nations. And so moving to the next slide, please, specific to this question around China, one of the challenges for Canada in this relationship and finding its way in between China and the US is that it took us way too long in Canada to see China as a potential rival rather than a market and trading partner. We were working very hard to believe that we were going to be able to constructively engage with China. Even as the US relationship with China was becoming more complicated, Canada was working differently. Canada had a very different view, and we were pursuing very different policy goals. Recent tensions, I think, have demonstrated that we need that shift, whether it's the two Michaels, whether it's some of the other variables that we saw, and this leads to the question, are we on the verge of a trade war? Well, we see the participation in TPP2, and we also, I think, saw really the challenge for Canada in navigating that relationship during the Trump administration. As the Trump administration in the U.S. ramped up its pressure on trade against China, Canada was caught in a really interesting position where it was really expected to go along with the U.S. side of things, and yet having to navigate its own interests and our own economic interests and political interests with China, demonstrating really clearly that we were still coming to grips with the idea that we didn't have our own clear vision and policy towards how we were going to engage with China. The US and China relationship is largely going to determine Canada's outcomes, opportunities, and likely tactics. We are not going to be able to simply say, as Canada, can't we just be able to move forward and do what we want to do? The answer is going to be no. We're going to have to operate within that broader structure and find that way. But on that vein, in order to do that, I think it's imperative that we go through in Canada an international strategy review. And to be able to account for this shift in order, that lack of vision and lack of coherence is hurting us actively in the way that we engage with the world, and especially as the relationship between the US and China and Canada and China becomes more complicated. And so we know that China is increasingly challenging American and Western power, and we have to be able to not only understand what that threat means, but how we're going to respond as those threats are going to be able to evolve. So moving to the last slide, I would say that bipolar structures require really careful consideration of foreign policy strategies and tactics, especially for middle powers. The fact that we're currently rudderless as the world order evolves and we have no clarity means that there's a real challenge, a fear that we're going to be left out or taken advantage of. And those are things that we definitely don't want. So while our options may be few as a middle power, we're not going to have nearly the options that other powers would have. It's important for us to see and engage China for what it is and to strategize accordingly as we look to move forward. And so I'm happy to leave it there.
Thank you so much. And finally, we will have Dr. Thomas Christensen with his presentation, Tensions Across the Taiwan Strait and Challenges for U.S. Policy. Thomas J. Christensen is the Interim Dean and James T. Shottle Professor of International Relations and the Director of China and the World Program at Columbia University. He arrived in 2018 from Princeton University, where he was the William P. Boswell Professor of World Politics of Peace and War, the Director of the Princeton-Harvard China and the World Program, and the Faculty Director of the Masters of Public Policy Program and the Truman Scholars Program. From 2006 to 2008, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, with the responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. His research and teaching focus are on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security. Dr. Thomas Christensen, you have the stage.
Thanks a lot, Safia. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the other panelists. I'm going to start by saying I never really liked the word hegemony. It's important to know where states sit in terms of relative power against each other for sure, but hegemony always implied to me that the most powerful state in the system can get whatever it wants in all or most contexts. And I don't think that's ever really been the case for the United States. Even in the peak of Cold War power for the United States in the early Cold War period, the United States was not capable of getting everything it wanted around the world. And I studied that period pretty carefully. Think about the Korean War and all the problems the United States had, even when it was very much in the lead during the Cold War. So context really matters. And in that spirit, I'm going to focus on cross-strait relations between mainland China and Taiwan as a major challenge for US policy and for US national security. From a global perspective, for reasons that Elizabeth laid out already, the United States is much more powerful than the PRC. The United States has global military power projection. China simply lacks it. The United States has the global reserve currency, which is a great source of American power, and it's been demonstrated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has 60 plus allies and partners. China has none of these characteristics, including the military power projection, if you take missiles out of the equation. The problem for the United States is that the places where the United States and the PRC are likely to clash and to come into conflict are very close to China and very far from the United States. So geography is the most important factor here. And the most important example of such potential flashpoints is Taiwan. So Taiwan is only 100 nautical miles off the PRC coast. And without any pretense of global power projection in the conventional realm, China can put at risk Taiwan. It can put at risk US regional bases that might be used to come to Taiwan's defense. It can put at risk forward deployed forces at sea and in the air of the United States. And it can put all of the US allies and partners in the region at risk with its current military capabilities, which are developing and getting stronger year on year. Beijing hopes with this growing military capacity to deter, delay, or defeat US forces that come to Taiwan's aid in a conflict. So deter the United States from coming to the assistance of Taiwan, delay American assistance if it's decided to send forces, and then defeat those forces if they are sent. And you'll be familiar with a lot of the military capabilities that Taiwan's developed, sophisticated missiles, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, submarines, many of which can fire such missiles, air defenses, very sophisticated air defenses that cover most of Taiwan, anti-satellite weapons, cyber weapons, and a modernizing nuclear force. China has a very good, very strong hand to play in cross-strait relations. But the good news from a US perspective is that attacking Taiwan for mainland China, it would still be very costly. There are a couple of major military options for China in a cross-strait conflict. One would be invasion. An invasion, if successful, could be decisive, but it's extremely difficult to launch an invasion of Taiwan, even though the mainland is much more powerful than Taiwan, and even though the US has to come from a distance if it chooses to come to Taiwan's aid. It's even more difficult to invade Taiwan than it was for the Russians to invade Ukraine, because sea and air invasions are much tougher than land invasions. So I would think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia's poor performance to date in that invasion must give some Chinese leaders pause about the dangers and risks of an invasion, despite the fact that there's no question that the mainland China is more powerful than Taiwan, and a big challenge to the United States in that regional context. A second option is a blockade. That's relatively easy for the mainland to launch against Taiwan. It's much harder for Taiwan or the United States or any of its partners to break. But it could be a very prolonged process. A blockade could be very costly to mainland China. It risks escalation with the United States, and it gives the United States time to intervene if it chooses to do so. And it gives the United States a chance to intervene on Washington's timetable. And there could be very big economic costs for the region and for China, which is integrated with the region. And the potential for very harsh sanctions to include the United States and its partners, maybe Canada as well, must be sobering to Chinese leaders, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the United States, its allies and partners have been relatively united in fairly harsh sanctions against Russia. So all of these challenges that the mainland China faces in dealing with its problems with Taiwan mean that deterrence of an actual attack is still possible, but it's becoming more difficult. The circumstances have to be right to successfully deter a mainland Chinese attack on Taiwan. And those successful elements of deterrence are credible threats on the one hand, of punishment, and credible assurances. And both sides are necessary in order to have successful stability across the Taiwan Strait and successful deterrence. On the credible threat side, the US needs to have a credible intervention plan if a US president were to decide to intervene in a cross-strait conflict. And that probably requires more dispersed mobile forces that can fight from longer ranges, because China's current military capabilities are putting at risk forward deployed bases, especially large bases. And the United States is going to have to be more nimble and able to fire more ordnance from a greater distance and have more mobile forces. You need to have enough defense capability on Taiwan in advance of a conflict and enough strategic reserves of critical materiel so that neither an invasion looks attractive and a blockade looks very costly. And again, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine so far has helped on this score, get people's attention to the idea that the Taiwan military needs to be prepared in advance, it needs to be well stocked, and the Taiwan society has to be well stocked to hold out in a long-term struggle. And that might make Taiwan a tougher nut to crack in the future. There has to be credible economic punishment. And again, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has helped on that score in terms of the credible threat side of the equation. But what a lot of people forget when they think of deterrence is that deterrence is twofold, and it doesn't just involve credible threats. It involves credible assurances. The threats need to be conditional on the target, that the target doesn't get punished even if it maintains the status quo. And we have to be careful in our relations with Taiwan, on the military front, on the political front, not to cross Beijing's red lines. And it's my opinion that there are certain things that the United States and Taiwan could do together that would make deterrence impossible, that the mainland would feel compelled to use force against Taiwan under those circumstances. So it's important, for example, for the United States to not support Taiwan independence, and it's important for Taiwan political leaders not to pursue permanent legal independence from the Chinese nation if war is going to be successfully deterred in the future. And I think despite all the criticism of US policy on both sides of the aisle in Washington, I think the US strategy towards cross-strait relations has been fantastically successful for the last decades. And it has been successful because it's involved some key elements that balance the need for both credible threats and credible assurances together. And those are commonly known as strategic ambiguity, about just under what conditions the United States would intervene. We have the Taiwan Relations Act, which calls for two things. One is the supply of defensive weapons to Taiwan, and the other is the maintenance of a capability for the United States to come to Taiwan's assistance militarily if the president were so to choose. It's not an obligation, but it's an obligation to stay prepared. And the United States in that light has maintained a very strong military presence in East Asia and is often in the process of rethinking that and rejiggering it and strengthening it. The United States at the same time has had a one China policy to include no support for Taiwan independence and no restoration of a formal US-Taiwan alliance, which existed in the Cold War from the 1954-55 period until 1979-1980. By doing so, they've provided the assurances that make deterrence work. So what worries me now about the US PRC strategic competition is not that the PRC has somehow caught up with the United States overall around the globe, but that for a combination of military and political reasons, it's more difficult to maintain the success of that policy towards cross-strait relations that has been so successful in the past. And the factors that make it more difficult are the military factors I discussed before, a lot more PRC military wherewithal than before, that really challenges forward deployed US forces. Chinese nationalism and assertiveness. Xi Jinping has emphasized two things that worry me. One, he has constantly emphasized the need for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's not a new theme, but he has put much more rhetorical muscle behind it. And he has also linked progress on unification with Taiwan as a prerequisite for progress on the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that Chinese nationalism links up badly for stability purposes with growing Taiwan nationalism. No one on the island, almost no one on the island of Taiwan wants unification with the mainland, peaceful or otherwise. And the numbers of people who want unification with the mainland is going down, not up. So the trend lines are dangerous from the mainland's perspective. And this is only more true after Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Which has made the PRC look more frightening and the prospect of attack more palpable to the public in Taiwan. The US, for its part, is very concerned about China's rise in general. And there are political trends in the United States that are drawing what I consider to be somewhat simple conclusions from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of those conclusions, it existed before, but it gained in currency, is the notion that somehow Taiwan can be used as a tool to contain China's growth or rise. This is a very dangerous concept for Taiwan's own security because there's very little to do. There's very little that can be done to protect Taiwan in a conflict from severe harm. Even if the US were to intervene.
Dr. Thomas Christensen, Thank you very much. I think if it's possible to stop now so we can have time for the question period.
Okay, if I could just add a couple
course.
more points. So there's a tendency to blame China for a lot of US problems, and that feeds into this. And there's a tendency to call, and especially on one side of the aisle, for clearer commitments to Taiwan. And I think those clearer commitments, if they were actually implemented in the future, perhaps in 2024 with a new election in the United States, and there'll be a new election in Taiwan, it seems to me that those types of policies are unnecessary because the Chinese military already expects and plans for a US intervention. So there's no need to clarify that strategic ambiguity that was there, that's been in there in the past. And the second thing is a lot of the proposals would restore what appears on the mainland to be a US-Taiwan formal alliance. And that's always been a precondition on the mainland for relations with Washington, normal diplomatic relations with Washington. It's also been a precondition on the mainland for keeping the peace. So I worry about those trends in the United States. I worry about the upcoming election in Taiwan, but I think that the policy that's been in place has been extremely successful and could be into the future, because a conflict across the Taiwan Strait is still very costly for the mainland and is not something that I think the mainland is eager to partake in the future. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you everyone. And now we will have the question period. So we already have some questions. So the first question for Dr. Elizabeth Larus: why do you think China's COVID lockdowns are persisting longer than the rest of the world, including the United States?
That is an excellent question. It is because of Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. China started this zero COVID policy back in 2020, and they have kept it for 2 years because Xi Jinping, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, has staked his reputation on it. Now, okay, so imagine he drops it, how catastrophic it could possibly be. Most of the elderly in China are still not vaccinated. China started vaccinating younger people and working age people. A lot of the elderly are not vaccinated. People in China who are vaccinated have been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccination, which its effectiveness I've seen could be questionable, right? It appears to prevent death, but people can get sick. Okay, so imagine the effectiveness is not so great, and COVID then is widespread and people start dying. China does not have the hospital facilities. The United States has about 26 doctors or hospital beds per 1,000. China has about 6. On any given day, Chinese emergency rooms are filled with people who are there for either catastrophic illnesses or something like a sore throat, because most people in China do not have insurance other than for catastrophic causes. And so if they are sick, they wait to the last minute, and then they use that insurance, but they're very, very ill. So the same thing probably would happen with COVID. And so there would be a lot of deaths, and Xi Jinping cannot have that on his reputation. He is not going to lift it. Never say never. And I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would put money on him not lifting zero COVID until after the 20th Party Congress, and probably not until 2023.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was a great answer. And for Dr. Bob Murray, doesn't Trump make it easier for Canada to identify a distinct independent path?
Yeah, good question. It should have. That absolutely should have served as the wake-up call that Canada needed, especially looking at what happened to Canada being dragged very quickly into a US-China bit of tension and the challenges that were posed and what it did to our relationship with China. Doesn't seem to have actually taken hold and led Canada down a path where we were going to suddenly learn from that, recognize the need that we were going to have to do things and be able to move those things into a new era. So I think Trump was supposed to be that ultimate wake-up call, not just because of the China piece, but because of other pieces as well. Watching the US retreat from multilateral institutions and traditional bases of how Canada pursues its foreign policy posed a challenge for Canada to have to start asking itself what happens in the international system and in a world order where the US may not actually have our back the way that we thought that it did. Trump era ends, Biden gets elected, and we really haven't seen any substantive change to Canada's foreign policy since. And so I'm not sure if it's that we're just taking too long to learn from it or we've chosen not to, but certainly we haven't seen that progress that I think we should have seen coming out of that era.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much for your answer. And now for Dr. Thomas Christensen, what do you think Taiwan is learning from Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
It's a great question. We know some things that certain people in Taiwan are drawing the lesson that a weaker power with the proper asymmetric capabilities and preparations can really hamper the progress of a stronger military. There is a debate in Taiwan about what kind of military equipment to purchase and what kind of military doctrine to adopt. And there's been a big push in recent years under President Tsai's leadership to adopt an asymmetric approach, more of an all-of-society approach, and more emphasis on things like mobile missiles that could be shoulder-held. And there's been pushback against that from some more traditional defense interests. And I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will strengthen the hand of the argument that Taiwan needs to rethink its approach to long-term defense and the kinds of ordnance that it should procure and the types of training that it should undergo. And I personally think that's a good thing for them to that conclusion is the right conclusion to draw. And I think they will also draw the conclusion that they need to have stockpiles of weapons to hold out. Because again, the one thing that the mainland has a huge advantage on would be blockading Taiwan from support after a conflict starts. So you'd want the Taiwan military should want to have stockpiles of equipment in advance of a conflict. So it's a great question. On the other hand, I think that there are people in Taiwan who say, well, the United States is unwilling to fight in Ukraine because Russia has nuclear weapons. And some people might draw the conclusion that the United States would not intervene in a cross-strait conflict. I don't think that's the correct conclusion to draw from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I can understand why the mainland is playing that up in its own social media manipulations in Taiwan, and why certain political elements in Taiwan have emphasized that point.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. And I think we have a few more questions. For Dr. Elizabeth Larus, hypothetically speaking, if China were to become the dominant power, do you think China would export communist policies to the rest of the world?
Not communist policies the way Karl Marx defined communism. He used the term communism because he wanted a really strong term, a politically loaded term for really socialism, which is an economic system, which means the state owns and controls the means of production, or the people own and control the means of production, which means the state does. So I don't think that China was going to export economic communism, economic socialism. However, I think that if China were to become the dominant power, that China would export what I would say is the principles of Leninism. And that is government that is run by a small force, the vanguard, right, of the proletariat. So there will be a very, very small elite crack group that will lead the people, and everyone must follow without dissent, because there only can be one leader. And so not only would the leadership of the country be very, very small, would power be in the hands of a few people, the political and civil rights that people enjoy. That is what they would export.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we have time for one final question, and then we will go for a break. So question for Thomas Christensen. The US Department of State website removed the wording that Taiwan is a part of China and that the US does not support Taiwan independence. Why did the state do this, and is it provocative?
I'm not sure why the State Department changed its website. The website was a little bit misleading. The website that was the website wording that was changed was a little bit misleading to the broad public. And the website never said that Taiwan is part of China. It said that the United States acknowledges the Chinese position, that there's one China and Taiwan is part of it. And that has been the traditional US position, actually, not just in the communiques going back to 1972, but also in US foreign policy going back to the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, which is that the United States takes no position on Taiwan's sovereign status in relation to mainland China, but it does not support Taiwan independence. And it calls for peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences in a way that is compatible with the interests of people on both sides of the strait. So that's the foundation of the ambiguity policy strategic ambiguity policy that I talked about before. But it hasn't been the case in the past that the United States said that Taiwan is part of China, and now it has stopped. It has been the case in the past that the United States has said the United States does not support Taiwan independence. Now, it would be a radical change if the State Department said, we're considering supporting Taiwan independence. They didn't do that, but they removed the general reassuring statement that the United States does not support Taiwan independence from the website. And we could speculate about why that's the case. It's probably the case that the Biden administration doesn't want to look like it's being weak on Taiwan in relation to China. And therefore, why mention something for which you could be criticized? So just leave it out. So I don't think it constitutes a change in policy, but it constitutes a change in diplomacy in a sense, in that you're leaving out part of your longstanding policy from the public discussion. And you asked about the reaction on the mainland. The reaction on the mainland, predictably, has been very negative. They have said that this is, basically supporting one Taiwan, one China, and so on and so and so. But it's not unusual for U.S. public pronouncements on cross-strait relations to lead to reactions on the mainland, but this one led to a predictable type of reaction. I personally think the United States should leave in that language of do not support Taiwan independence, particularly as we go into the 2024 election. President Tsai in Taiwan has been a great leader, in my opinion. She's been very strategic, very moderate. She has avoided provocations to the mainland that might lead to a military crisis. But I don't think she's highly representative of her own party, the Democratic Progressive Party. And there are much more radical elements in that party. And she is forbidden to run for office again under the Republic of China Constitution that reigns over Taiwan. So she will be replaced in her own party by other elements. And the question is, will those other elements be as moderate as she is? Will the electoral competition lead to more radical statements? And will cross-strait relations get more tense? And then on the US side, in the same year, 2024, we're going to have an election. And it's really unclear who will win that election. And we know that Mike Pompeo has said that the United States should recognize Taiwan as a nation. And we know that John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, says the U.S. should station troops in Taiwan, a large number of troops, basically forming an alliance again. And I personally think that either of those policies would cause a war. And my basic rule of life is you can't deter a war by causing one. And I return to the point that no matter how many forces the United States throws at the problem, there's nothing the United States can do to protect Taiwan from severe harm. So my other saying about this is that all Americans love Taiwan. Some Americans want to love Taiwan to death.
Very well said. Thank you so much for your answer. And now we'll be going for a brief break and coming back for panel 2 at 2:15 p.m.
Thanks to all. I'm sorry I have to go early.
No, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Well, hello everyone. We are now 2:15, so I think we can start panel 2. And so panel 2 will be on China's current foreign policy tactics, and we will have Dr. David Welch from the University of Waterloo and Dr. Lynette from the University of Toronto speaking. I will let Dr. David Welch have the stage with his presentation, China's current foreign policy tactics, East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. David Welch is the University Research Chair and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. He teaches at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and is co-editor with Tony Erskine and Stefano Guzzini of International Theory. His 2005 book, Painful Choices, A Theory of Foreign Policy Change, is the inaugural winner of the International Studies Association ISSS Book Award for the best book published in 2005 or 2006. And his 1993 book, Justice and the Genesis of War, is the winner of the 1994 Edgar S. Furness Award for an outstanding contribution to national security studies. Dr. David Welch, I will let you have the floor.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to participate. I want to start by emphasizing what this panel is about. It's about China's foreign policy tactics, and it's important to distinguish strategy from tactics. So when states attempt to accomplish something, when anybody attempts to accomplish anything, they usually have the strategy in mind, which is an overarching vision of how they are to attain their goals. And they employ tactics, and tactics are local, tailored, on the ground kind of responses to situations intended to promote the goals of a fundamental underlying strategy. So if you have a country that has a coherent foreign policy, you'll be able to have a sense of its overall strategy, grand picture as it were. But you may see quite interestingly different tactics, depending on the context and the situation that they're trying to manage. And this is indeed what we do see in some of the big flashpoints in East Asia. And I want to concentrate on three. I think they're three of the most important. There's another one, of course, which is the Korean Peninsula. I don't have time to get into that. And China is not a frontline player in that one in any case, but it is a frontline player in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. These are all plausibly three areas where a major war could break out between China and its neighbors, or between China and the United States. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Taiwan is the single most dangerous flashpoint in the world. If World War III doesn't break out as a result of Russia's current adventurism in Ukraine, it might well break out in Taiwan. So we should be especially worried about that. And I'll explain why. So let me start with tactics, and then at the end I'll say a few words about what I think they say collectively about Chinese strategy. Next slide, please. I'll start with the East China Sea, which is, next slide again, just the maritime area to the east of China, south and southwest of Japan, north of Taiwan. And here China is involved in an important series of disputes with Japan primarily. And there are two kinds of disputes. There are maritime disputes, which is to say that China and Japan disagree on the appropriate delimitation of their maritime jurisdiction. And there's also a sovereignty dispute. And the sovereignty dispute concerns the Senkaku Islands, which are very small rocky outcroppings, quite close to Taiwan, in fact. Taiwan claims them as well, interestingly. So you've actually really got three countries, since Taiwan's a de facto country, vying for title to legitimate sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands. But they've been occupied by Japan since 1895, and when the United States handed back sovereignty to Japan of islands it had occupied at the end of World War II, it handed back operational control of the Senkaku Islands to Japan as well. So basically they're under Japanese administration, but they're currently uninhabited. Now, I am fascinated by why countries have fierce rivalries over useless islands, and in this case, over useless rocks. And I really would go so far as to say that these are utterly useless rocks, but they're pregnant with symbolic significance. The maritime dispute between China and Japan is actually under fairly good regulation. There's technically a bit of a dispute over who should be entitled to drill for natural gas at the far eastern edge of the continental shelf. quite far north from the Senkaku Islands. In fact, China is the only country that's got gas drills up there, and it's because it's physically impossible to ship gas from that area to Japan because of the intervening deep oceanic trench. So that's really a non-issue. The important issue is the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, and this came to a head in 2012 when arch-nationalist Shintaro Ishihara in Japan, who was a fierce critic of Japan's kid gloves approach to China, thought that the central government was being too pussyfooted about its treatment of Japanese rights and proposed to buy the Senkaku Islands from their private owners. And everyone knew that if he did that successfully, he would immediately start building structures and putting people in place there permanently, which to the Chinese, who are longstanding claimants, would be a red flag in front of the bull, right? And they would feel compelled to respond to it. So this proposed offer to buy the islands triggered a counteroffer from the Japanese central government to buy the islands from the private owners, and so the islands were nationalized. China saw this as an outrageous escalation in a long-standing territorial dispute. In fact, Japan designed this to try to prevent a crisis with China, but it triggered one. And so the response that China mounted, in addition to violent demonstrations in the streets of Chinese cities and burning and looting Japanese businesses and people burning Japanese cars and so on, outrage over Japan's nationalization of so-called Chinese territory. The government's main response has been to step up and maintain kind of a demonstration of non-recognition of Japanese sovereignty in the form of sailing ships into the maritime contiguous zone and territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands and flying aircraft within the airspace of the Senkaku Islands. Next slide, please. This chart shows you just how many times the Japanese have had to scramble fighter planes to meet Chinese aerial incursions over the Senkaku Islands. Next slide. This one shows you how many times Chinese boats have ventured into the contiguous zone and the territorial sea around the Senkaku Islands. And you can see that 2012 is a tipping point, a liminal point. But you'll also see, and this is quite interesting, fairly steady Chinese activity. In other words, once they escalated, they didn't really continue to escalate, and they didn't de-escalate. It's sort of some up and down from month to month. But for the most part, this is what China has been doing. It's just been kind of constantly signaling that it doesn't recognize Japanese sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands by challenging maritime and airspace sovereignty. Next slide, please. The other thing China did in 2013 was declare the establishment of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, which you see here outlined in red. This caused an international crisis as the world reacted in fear and horror at China attempting to assert its jurisdiction over the East China Sea with an air defense identification zone. This furor demonstrated that nobody knows what an air defense identification zone is. It's got no jurisdictional implication whatsoever. Any country, anytime, can declare an air defense identification zone wherever they want. It doesn't give them any legal rights. It's just a convenience for them to try to reduce the number of times they have to scramble aircraft to identify unidentified intruders. So the Chinese government didn't actually realize this. And the backstory is fascinating. It was a PLA initiative to attempt to assert jurisdiction. The foreign ministry was cut out of this decision. People in the foreign ministry were aware that this was actually just a bad move and had tried to oppose it, but they didn't have the opportunity. So that was 2013. Interestingly, China doesn't really operate this air defense identification zone at the moment. They don't have the capacity, and they've just kind of let it go. So that's what's been happening in the East China Sea tactically. Just a kind of a steady drumbeat of signaling that doesn't run any major risk of confrontation with Japan. As long as Japan doesn't escalate by, for example, putting troops or missile batteries or installations on the Senkaku Islands, I think we can expect this to be the norm going forward. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the South China Sea, which gets a lot more attention these days, probably rightly because it's more complicated. It's also more interesting. Next slide, please. Here's a map of the South China Sea, and what you see here in yellow are all of the features, the territorial features that are disputed in the South China Sea. These are the things that countries can't agree on which country has sovereignty over. China claims them all. So does Taiwan. Vietnam claims a bunch, the Philippines claim a bunch, Malaysia claims a bunch. So there's multiple overlapping claims in some cases. Three important rough groups of features here in the northwest here, you see the Paracel Islands. Those are occupied by China, claimed by Vietnam. The Spratly Islands, it's the lower collection, by far the largest number. Again, entirely claimed by China and Taiwan. Taiwan only actually physically controls one. They control the best one, but they only have one. China only controls 7, and China's 7 are actually not very good quality features. And then Malaysia and the Philippines control quite a few. This is where most of the press activity has been. And then Scarborough Shoal in the upper right, standing there on its lonesome, is contested by the Philippines and China. Next slide, please. If you're interested in a detailed understanding of who actually controls what in the South China Sea, you can find it here. And so it's the Spratly Islands are kind of like an alphabet soup of the different countries occupying different features. Next slide, please. Now, one thing you will encounter if you read about the South China Sea anywhere is this stock phrase that China claims virtually all of the South China Sea. You'll see this everywhere. This is actually technically not true. All China has clearly claimed is territorial sovereignty over all of the rocks and islands, and they also claim it over shoals and so on. They have for many years, however, ambiguously kind of led people to believe that they also claim maritime jurisdiction over the South China Sea. And this is what the neighboring countries fear and what they object to most. Next slide, please. And to try to, bolster their position in the Spratly Islands and assert their presence, the Chinese engaged in a very aggressive artificial island building campaign, transforming their 7 low-grade features in the Spratly Islands into pretty formidable military outposts, 3 of which have the full runways, capable of handling military aircraft. China's activities in the South China Sea prompted the government of the Philippines in 2012 to file a suit in The Hague under provisions of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, effectively to try to undermine any possible Chinese claim to extensive jurisdiction. Next slide, please. This is the courtroom. And you'll see on the left the Philippines legal team, and you'll see on the right the Chinese legal team, which isn't there, because China refused to participate, refused to acknowledge that the tribunal had any authority, claimed that it was all subterfuge on the part of the Philippines. So they didn't participate. But they did, however, make a terrible mistake, which was to write in too much detail why they weren't participating. And that gave the tribunal ample material to work with to actually recreate a good faith Chinese account of the defense they would have mounted if they were there. Next slide, please. Most of the arguments had to do with a lot of arcane interpretation of the provisions of the law of the sea. In other words, what maritime entitlements attached to what features. It's terribly complicated. The most interesting outcome of the tribunal ruling was that there are no islands, technical legal islands in the South China Sea, at least not in the Spratlys and not in Scarborough Shoal. They're all either rocks or low tide elevations. And under the UN Convention, none of those gets an exclusive economic zone. At most, they get a territorial sea, which is only 12 nautical miles instead of 200. So this had the effect of effectively undermining any possible extensive Chinese claim to maritime jurisdiction in the South China Sea. Even if they did have rightful sovereignty over all of the Spratly Islands, their jurisdiction would extend only 12 nautical miles around each of them. So most of the South China Sea would still be international waters or fall under the exclusive economic zones of literal states, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, so on. So China in fact, has no right to an exclusive economic zone anywhere near the Spratleys Islands. This was hugely embarrassing to China. And the interesting, from my perspective, one of the most interesting outcomes of this process was that all of a sudden, China started to behave. Now, the rest of the world hasn't really noticed this. Next slide, please. You still have this dominant narrative that China is being expansionistic and aggressive, and it's an outlaw state. And the United States, in response, has stepped up freedom of navigation operations by sailing ships very close to features controlled by China, not just China, but mostly China. And this chart shows you how many freedom of navigation operations the Americans have sailed since they began under President Obama. But next slide, please. As I said, China's really been keeping its nose clean. If you look really carefully, they have stopped doing things that are technically inconsistent with the Philippines Arbitration Tribunal ruling. They just stopped talking about the 9-dash line, which everyone thought was a basis of a legal claim. The tribunal ruled it had no legal status. They've stopped trying to enforce their own jurisdiction more than 12 nautical miles from features that they claim. There's a whole range of things they just stopped doing. The idea here is they know they lost. They know that their claims are actually not sustainable, and that the UN convention that they've signed and ratified doesn't justify the extensive claims that the Chinese people think China has a right to. But the Chinese people still think that China has extensive maritime rights in the South China Sea, and the regime is desperate not to look like it's lost at the tribunal, or that it doesn't have the rights that everyone in China thinks they have. So they're walking this tightrope. And it's a complex story with an interesting explanation. If you're interested, in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a recent article I published with my colleague Mark Raymond that goes into gory detail, explaining exactly what's going on and why. But people generally haven't noticed that China is actually a much better citizen in the South China Sea now than they were before. Next slide, please. Part they don't notice, because China is still kind of aggressively trying to prevent other countries from doing things that would make it obvious that China lost. And so you get a lot of signaling, and you get a lot of, well, I don't know if it's a lot. You probably also get some back channel sort of threats that China might react badly if other countries did things that were within their sovereign rights, like drilling for oil in their own exclusive economic zones, that would make it obvious to the Chinese people that China doesn't have jurisdiction over those areas. So it's a incredibly delicate balancing act that's going on at the moment in the South China Sea. So again, technically very interesting, quite different in some interesting ways from what they've been doing in the East China Sea, which is a very straightforward policy of just sending a signal and maintaining it. Okay, next slide, please. Taiwan. We've already heard a lot about Taiwan. We've heard a lot about Taiwan that's very good, and I don't want to repeat any of that. Next slide, please. Just the reminder as to where Taiwan is. Relatively small island, relatively close to mainland China, but far enough away that it would be really a very big technical challenge for the Chinese to invade it. It would be a much more challenging amphibious operation than even D-Day in World War II. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about the United States' inability to help defend Taiwan against Chinese invasion. My own read is that the Taiwanese can probably do very well all by themselves, in part because there are no beaches. The Chinese don't have any amphibious landing craft, at least not enough to land on the beaches if they were there. Chinese would be almost entirely dependent upon using existing port infrastructure to unload invading troops. That's not going to happen. So, we're a decade away from China actually being able to mount a credible military threat against Taiwan. And the Ukraine war, I think, is making the Chinese think even further about the viability of a military solution to that particular problem. Next slide, please. But I agree with Tom Christensen that Tsai Ing-wen has actually been doing a great job of making sure that Taiwan doesn't cross any particular red line that would effectively force China to act on Taiwan. But the long-term problem remains. Next slide, please. And the long-term problem is that the Taiwanese decreasingly identify as Chinese. Next slide, please. These are opinion polls taken of Taiwan, asking Taiwanese people, how do you identify? Do you identify as Taiwanese only? Do you identify as Chinese only? Or do you identify as both? There is a very strong, clear trend that over time, Taiwanese are going to stop identifying as Chinese or even as both Taiwanese and Chinese and just identify as Taiwanese. And so Taiwan has lost any interest in actually making good on its traditional claim that the rightful government of all of China is in Taipei at the moment. And it's almost inevitable, I think, at some point that Taiwanese will just say, we're not interested in ruling the mainland anymore. So we're two separate countries. Now, part of Tsai Ing-wen's genius is that she's able to thread the needle here by avoiding any sort of unilateral declaration of independence that might trigger a Chinese strike of some sort, but also by insisting that Taiwan is already an independent country. And this is right there on the presidential website. So there's no secret that she thinks, and the majority of Taiwanese legislators think, that Taiwan is already a separate country, that there really are two Chinas. And Taiwan does a pretty good job of navigating, the complexities of world politics to assert itself as an independent polity. And it's increasingly getting support from other countries as well. China doesn't like this. China doesn't react well when the United States does things or American officials say things that make it sound like they're tending to support Taiwanese independence increasingly over time. Next slide, please. And again, the main Chinese response we have seen has been military signaling. So China has been flying aircraft in formation, in varying numbers, varying kinds of aircraft and so forth, close to Taiwan. But interestingly, never into Taiwan's territorial airspace. They've only been flying missions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which, as I noted earlier, doesn't confer any jurisdiction of any kind. So it's actually a fairly timid signal. It's kind of, we're here, we don't like what you're doing. Pay attention to us and our needs and concerns. And next slide, please. There's a plausible argument to make that the real intended audience for these missions is in Washington and not in Taipei. Because Tsai Ing-wen knows what she's doing. She's not going to cross the red line. But it's not clear that American decision makers know what they're doing. And you could easily imagine them stepping way across Chinese red lines. So again, that's really what's been going on tactically in Taiwan. China's actually it's being careful, but it's trying to be as clear as it can in communicating to the United States that, leave it alone. Now, is this sustainable over the long run? Maybe not. Xi Jinping has said a few times that, the Taiwan problem is not one that can be postponed indefinitely, that, Chinese patience is not infinite. That's all pretty ominous. And I do worry that at some point China will decide, it's now or never and try to solve matters, take them into their own hands. I also agree emphatically, however, with Elizabeth, who presented in the first session, that China's rise is not continuing. China has probably, in significant respects, peaked, and that they may not have any opportunity in the future to be in a better position than they are now, which again could tempt them to try to solve the problem now rather than wait and hope that they'll be in a better position to solve it later. So next slide, that's pretty much what I have to say. Apart from, is there a grand underlying strategy here? I think so. And I think the grand underlying strategy is make sure international politics doesn't threaten the domestic rule of the Communist Party of China. It's all about keeping Xi Jinping in power. It's all about keeping the party in power. And if you sort of see that as the overarching governmental goal, it makes sense not only of Chinese foreign policy tactics, it also makes a lot of sense of Chinese domestic political behavior. And that, I think, is what it's all about. And is the Communist Party going to succeed in maintaining itself in power? That's going to be a very interesting question. If the economic growth fails, if COVID containment results in unrest, any number of things could actually cause civil unrest of the kind that could threaten the stability and legitimacy of the regime. But they just don't want international politics to serve as that kind of push, that kind of trigger. And that's, in my view, the best way to understand what they do tactically in these various flashpoints. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And now we will have Dr. Lynette on with her presentation. Where does Canada fit in the US-China rivalry? Dr. Lynette Ong is an associate professor of political science, jointly appointed at the department and the Munk School of Global Affairs Asian Institute. Primarily a China expert, she has also published on Southeast Asia and India. Her research interests lie at the intersection of authoritarianism, contentious politics, and development. She has held the position of director of the Munk School China Initiative, the acting director of the Contemporary Asian Studies Program, and the director of the East Asia Seminar Series at the Asian Institute for many years. Dr. Lynette Ong, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. So I would like to speak about where does Canada fit into the US-China rivalry. So next slide, please. So we know that there's great power competition between US and China in many different aspects. We have heard today a lot about what it means in terms of military competition. China has increased its expenditures on military by many folds over the last 2 decades. The exact number is still a guess, but there's no doubt that militarily China is way more powerful now than it is a decade ago. And in many ways, it is in preparation for a war in Taiwan and with its aggressive stance in the South China Sea. But aside from military competition, there's also intense competition between the two powers in economic spheres. For a long time, China's comparative advantage is in low-cost labor, and that in a way complements the US comparative advantage very well, where the US has more human talent and more capital that is able to invest in China and make use of its low-cost capital. But since about 15 years ago, China's comparative advantage in low-cost labor is actually drying up. It has, in a way, in some ways, moved up the economic ladder. It has also been able to produce a lot more graduates that is doing technological innovation in some areas, not every areas, in some areas where it is able to copy Western technologies and improve its reach to market. So the last mile, the Chinese technological companies are able to do fairly well, even though they are not so capable in terms of basic research. So there's also increased economic competition, and with the current tension going on now between the two countries, the US has actually ordered a company like TSMC in Taiwan and various high-tech companies to not supply inputs that goes into high-tech manufacturing in China. So there's a great deal of tension in terms of economic cooperation there that has been going on for a long time. There's also been technological competition. We in Canada are very familiar with the case of Huawei, and the Chinese would often say that the US has made so much fuss about Huawei is because in the United States they do not have a competitor. They don't have a competitive company in terms of 5G technology. So they are worried about China overtaking the United States. But I think, at the end of the day, it is really a competition about which political system is more superior, and whether or not this is a triumph of democracy versus autocracy, or democracy versus communism. I think in many ways, the debate at the root cause of it is about which political values and which political system actually ultimately prevails in producing a more powerful country. Next slide, please. Okay, China's foreign policy. So for a long time, the principle of China's foreign policy under Deng Xiaoping, and all the way until Jiang Zemin, and many would say even throughout Hu Jintao's administration, has been one of hiding your strength and biding your time, meaning that you should not seek too much attention in the international stage because you're still a developing country. Should concentrate your resources into developing the economy. But I think since about 5-7 years ago, there has been a structural shift that China under Xi Jinping is out there to pursue a very ambitious China dream. And the underlying narrative of the China dream is one of national rejuvenation, as Tom Christensen has talked about, and really is about restoring China's rightful place in history. And I have italicized the word restore because this is not about China coming to the international stage for the first time. This is about restoring what it once occupied, right? And it also sees it as somehow a rightful occupation of a prominent position in the world stage. So in a way, there is a little bit of an entitlement attitude that China sees itself, that it was once upon a very strong and powerful country, the so-called Middle Kingdom, and now economically it is once again strong enough to pursue that sort of position. So in accordance with that, we have seen wolf warrior diplomacy, which is really not very diplomatic, the way that Chinese diplomats, foreign spokesperson from the foreign ministry, how they perform, how they interact with foreign government. There's nothing diplomatic about diplomacy. So that's sort of very brazen and aggressive and assertive type of positioning. Is, I think, a manifestation of years of humiliation right from the late Qing dynasty, and that is coming through. That sort of inferiority complex is then coming through. That is now manifested in the way that foreign diplomacy is carried out in China. The other major element within Chinese politics is the emergence of ultra-nationalism. Ultra-nationalism in the sense that I think the Chinese Communist Party has been playing up nationalism, using it as a tool to justify its many policies. It has been so successful to the extent that nationalism has become a double-edged sword. Double-edged sword in the sense that it has come back to bite the government. That the government hands are actually tied. The party's hands are tied if it doesn't appear to be strong enough in standing against foreign criticism, right? So in a way, it has become a victim of its own success, and we have seen this played out in many instances, such as its COVID policy, its relations with respect to Taiwan, with respect to South Korea, and with respect to Japan, and also with respect to Canada. That over on social media, many netizens have actually asked the government to be very strong vis-a-vis Canadian position. Next slide, please. So we have also heard a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and how ambitious it is and its potential impact on Canada. On that front, I think China is actually not as strong as how people usually perceive. The Belt and Road Initiative is ambitious. A lot of money, financial resources has been put into it, but it's also a rather incoherent policy. On top of that, it is rather decentralized. Decentralized in the sense that there's kind of policy announcement at the central level, but implementation, actual programming is done at the decentralized level, and that includes provincial government as well as enterprise level, state-owned enterprises and various development banks within China that is disbursing financial assistance to companies investing abroad. So, and all these things are not necessarily centrally coordinated, right? It's a very fragmented type of approach. So what you have is multiple actors actually running the so-called Belt and Road Initiative projects. And they're all seen or projected by international media as representing China. But a Chinese company, how it behaves in Africa, right, versus how another state-owned enterprise behave in a project in Malaysia could tell you very different thing about China. But I think a lot of international perception tend to see Belt and Road Initiative, there's one unitary actor behind driving BRI. But in fact, I think that is actually quite far from the truth. If you were to peel behind that sort of multiplicity of actors, you see complexities behind how BRI actually works and how fragmented Chinese politics actually is. And BRI has also received a lot of pushback from host countries, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Australia, and to some extent, Canada. Next slide, please. No, this is China under Xi Jinping. Okay. So China under Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping is really the emperor for life. Under Xi Jinping, there's a great deal of centralization of power, political power. The first thing when he got into his position was to launch this massive and very ambitious anti-corruption campaign. In rhetoric, this is about cleaning up the bureaucracy. But the subtle message is he is also out there to clean up any remaining opposition that might stand in the way of his plan to be emperor for life. So he has cleaned up a lot of factional infighting within his own party. There's also a great deal of economic centralization. There has been advancement of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, into private sphere. There has been a lot of establishment of Chinese Communist Party cell in private organizations and social organization. There has been increased state control over the economy, and more recently, reigning in technology giants such as Alibaba, such as WeChat. If we think about what are the household Chinese brands that we are aware of? Jack Ma from Alibaba, Pony Ma from WeChat, from Weixin. And these, very successful Chinese companies have been actually reined in by the state, reined in by the CCP over the past year or so. Because I think for a long time, Chinese government sees value in what they do, including the ability to improve social control by carry out censorship on behalf of the state and on behalf of the CCP. But I think the CCP has become so distrustful of the private sector that it is now trying to do almost everything in itself, and not trusting the partners in the society that it used to trust. So overall, there has been intensified repression across society through traditional means, but also through new technological means, particularly in the restive regions of Xinjiang and Hong Kong. I'm sure you have heard a lot about that, so I won't I won't elaborate further. Next slide, please. But what I do want to talk about is a little bit about the book, my book, which has just been released, which is going to be published next week. So this is this is a project that I started out back in 2011. You might be aware of, back in 2011, when I first started this project, China was in a very, very different place. The central argument that I'm making in this book is the way to think about how the CCP carry out repression is, yes, you have the coercive apparatus, you have the public security, you have the national security, but I would argue what makes China a really, really powerful state, what I call everyday state power, how it is actually manifested every day in Chinese society, is the way in which the Chinese Communist Party is able to outsource repression to two types of actors. Number one, violent agents, which is thugs and gangsters. And number two, non-violent agents. These are the grassroots brokers. So these violent agents are, like the book cover is portraying, these are anonymous people. It could be anyone from the Chinese street. You pull any person out. This person doesn't have a regular salaried job, and he's willing to sell his muscle power for money. I've been told that this is usually costs about 100 yuan per day, and this sort of project will go on for a couple of months. So the empirical context that I study is housing demolition and land grabs in China, how the state regularly outsource coercion to thugs for hire. And this sort of thugs for hire is also quite different from gangsters and mafias, very well organized mafias that we know of in, let's say, Russia. Because when it becomes too powerful, then it would pose a challenge to state legitimacy. But the beauty of thugs for hire in China, I argue, is actually they are disorganized. They are actually loose individuals that they could actually be mobilized by the state to get the job done, state project done. However, they are actually not organized enough on their own that they would actually pose a threat to the state. And the other type of mobilized grassroots actors are residence committee, volunteers, which are totally independent of the state, but they feel that contributing to volunteering their time to the community is actually contributing to social goods. So even though I study housing demolition and I illustrate in the book how they work in terms of mobilization by the state and then trying to persuade people to sign on to papers to agree to demolition. In fact, we see how this is being carried out in lockdown, let's say in Shanghai. We think about how China is able to implement its zero COVID policy for the last couple of years so successfully until very recently, thanks to residence committee and thanks to the volunteers, right? And these are the people able to mobilize by the state to carry out state policies, from housing demolition to land grabs and now to zero COVID policy. Next slide, please. Canada is part of. But in terms of technology competition and economic competition, which take up a lot of bandwidth in terms of the two great power competition, in some areas, Canada is actually more complementary with China. So I think in some areas there's still scope for cooperation between us and China in that respect. So to carry out the arguments to its logical conclusion, I would think the policy for Canada then is one about strategic alignment with the United States, that we have to align with the United States in areas that is actually compatible with our interests, right? But there is also about selected competition with China. Unlike the United States, we do not compete with China in every areas. However, it is also important, I think, to recognize that China today is fundamentally different from China, the way China was 5 or 10 years ago. And over the last 20 years, we see that how Canada's policy towards China has actually vacillated from one end to another, from very anti-China during Harper's years, even though in his later years he then changed his position, to very friendly towards China in early years of Justin Trudeau. I think either of the two polarized position is not actually helpful, because what China is has also changed. The nature of Chinese politics has actually changed over the last decade, particularly under Xi Jinping. And I think now, China's position, Canada's position with respect to China is really couched or framed overall within the Indo-Pacific strategy. And that is the position that the Biden administration is also taking. And my own reading is that, this is happening because of two reasons. Number one, neither the United States or Canada know how to deal with China directly. We just do not have the strength, or we just have no, smart policy yet to deal with China. And number two, this is China policy is framed within the Indo-Pacific strategy, is because Indo-Pacific is, such as the countries in the Quad Alliance, such as the ASEAN countries, are right in China's backyard. To deal with China effectively, we need to build long-lasting partnership and to build friendship with the Indo-Pacific countries. Is only, we shouldn't be using the word encircling, but it's only by making friends with people in China's backyard, then I think we could have a smart strategy about how to deal with China's rise more effectively. So I will leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And yes, thank you so much to both of you for being here and for giving us these presentations. And now we will have the question period. We already have a few questions, but feel free, the audience can feel free to type your questions in the chat, and it can address to like one specific presenter or everyone. And so I think the first question is one for Dr. David Welch. Since you are also a Japan expert, what is Japan's role in managing this relationship? And is that where Canada can fit in, helping Japan navigate all of this, or copying Japan's strategy?
Thanks. Well, first, I don't describe myself as a Japan expert. I'm very careful not to do that. But I like to think of myself as a security expert, security person. In any case, that said, Japan has clearly thrown in its lot with the United States unambiguously. I think that is a positive thing. That's exactly where Japan should be. I think the US-Japan security relationship has been sort of the cornerstone of peace and security in East Asia since the very beginning. And Canada, of course, is not a member of the US-Japan alliance, but Canada can signal its support symbolically. It can contribute in a helpful way. For example, as it's been doing now through Operation Neon, sending military assets to help contain North Korea, enforce sanctions against North Korea. As long as Canada is sort of in step with the United States and Japan in its signaling, I think that's the most effective kind of contribution we can make. Japan will let the Americans take the lead, but they're very unambiguously signaling to China that Taiwan in particular, a Taiwan contingency would be a Japan contingency. And that's becoming a bit of a mantra. And I think the Chinese now clearly understand that if they take military action against Taiwan, they're probably also going to be involved in military action with the United States and Japan, at least in some level and in some form. And again, that can only help boost deterrence.
Thank you so much for your answer. And we have another question for Dr. Lynette Ong. What possible strategies can Canada employ to respond to China's will for diplomacy, especially online?
If you want my honest opinion, I would think, we should just ignore it. The reason is, I think, if we understand why they behave the way they do, I think it fundamentally stems from a sense of inferiority and feeling inadequate that they have actually arrived. So, they are learning how to behave diplomatically. I think the way to deal with this sort of behavior is just to ignore it, because by engaging with that sort of behavior, by being aggressive with them, we are just going to provoke further behavior, and it's just going to breed a vicious cycle. So be mature and be smart about it if we want to really respond very selectively, and one shouldn't get too emotional about it.
Thank you very much. And I also have a question for you myself, Dr. Lynette. So you mentioned that like in the last few years, Xi Jinping has, cracked down on the private sector, him and the CCP. Why exactly is that, do you think?
There are a number of reasons. Number one, some would say Xi Jinping is just being Xi Jinping, that he's a really ambitious individual. He is son of a princeling. His father was a high-level CCP official who has served alongside Mao and fought in the revolution. His formative years were spent during the Cultural Revolution in the countryside. His whole formative experience has been about communism, right? So he's a communist fellow, and very much produced by the system and is still part of the system. So this is a very personality driven explanation. But the more institutional or structural reason is, if you look at the shape of Chinese economy, the way that it is now, even though I would agree that it has actually peaked, but the shape of Chinese economy is in much better shape compared to a decade or 3-4 decades ago. So in a way, I think the economy, size of the economy, scale of the economy, and its might has afforded its leader the confidence to pursue political objectives, things that they feel that has really reasonably belonged to them, that was taken away from them since the late Qing dynasty, since the beginning of 1900s. National humiliation, they have to cede Hong Kong to the British, have to carve out Macau to the Portuguese, and those are, very humiliating experience as far as the PRC is concerned. And now they have reached a stage where they can claim back what they have lost.
Thank you very much for your answer. Also, I think we have a question for both of you. And I think you can both answer it if you wish. We know that Canada needs to secure more bilateral trade agreements with more countries in order to compete with the United States. How do we get our national defense policies to reflect this economic need for Canadian GDP?
I think this should be a question for Professor Welch.
Well, it's an intriguing question. I would say at the grand level, the Canadian and American economies are symbiotic, so they aren't really competing economies. There's competition in specific sectors and between specific firms, but the grand scheme of things, the Canadian economy does well when the American economy does well, and so on. Trade agreements, of course, promote predictability, stability, enhance trade flows, and these can generate wealth. So trade agreements usually very good things. Whether they're bilateral, multilateral, it doesn't necessarily matter. And Canada has both, has had both bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Specifically with respect to this part of the world, the CPTPP is a multilateral agreement. Canada got a pretty good deal and managed to make sure the negotiations reflected Canadian interests pretty well. I don't think our defense policy bears terribly on the likelihood of conducting trade deals, but the more countries of the region appreciate our contribution in security matters, the less they'll see us as basically mercenary and only looking for economic benefits to engagement. And that's where Canada has fallen down in the last 20 years, as we more or less disappeared from the security tables in the region. And we were all just talking trade all the time, and it frankly annoyed countries of the region who really felt that Canada should be a full partner if it was to get any kind of concessionary treatment at all on anything. So I think we finally realized that. We're trying to get back in. We're trying to make more of a constructive security commitment on multilateral and bilateral trade deals, I think Canada should go ahead and cut a deal with Taiwan, basically for a bilateral trade arrangement that is exactly on the terms of the CPTPP. And so in effect, you would have concurrent Taiwanese accession to the CPTPP through legislation rather than necessarily as a treaty partner. Of course, if Taiwan signed on as a full treaty partner to the CPTPP, then China would go crazy. But China has no realistic objection to concurrent legislation establishing terms of trade on CPTPP terms with Taiwan. So Canada should go ahead and do that, and show the rest of the partnership how to do that. And I think Japan would do the same very quickly, and maybe everyone else would follow suit too. That would be also a contribution to, international support for Taiwan's autonomy. So that's one thing I would encourage us to think about seriously.
Thank you very much for your answer. And again, thank you both so much for being here. And it's great to see your expertise, but also you interacting with the other presenters that went previously. So I think we will, panel 2 will come to a close, and we will be going for a break and coming back at 3:30 for panel 3. And again, thank you so much, Dr. David Welch and Dr. Lynette Ong, for being here. It means so much, and we really appreciate your expertise.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
30 on the dot. Back to panel 3. This is our last panel, and it will be about Canadian foreign policy options in the aftermath of the AUKUS agreement. We will have Dr. Stephanie Carvin from Carleton University and Don Newman from Rubicon Strategy speaking. I will let Dr. Stephanie Carvin take the stage with her presentation, Canadian foreign policy options in the aftermath of AUKUS. Stephanie Carvin is an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa. Her research focuses on national and international security and technology. She holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, and her dissertation was published as Prisoners of America's Wars, from the Early Republic to Guantanamo. In 2009, Dr. Stephanie Carvin was a visiting scholar at George Washington University Law School during her sabbatical, and also worked as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense Law of War Working Group and the American Red Cross's Educating International Humanitarian Law Project. From 2012 to 2015, she was an analyst with the Government of Canada, focusing on national security issues. From 2014 to 2015, she was a research associate at Center for the International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Stephanie Carvin, you have the stage.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today here at this conference. It's just been amazing speakers, and I'm really fortunate to have heard from them and now kind of maybe take some of the things that they've said and bring it into my own presentation. So slide, please. Next slide. There we go. So I call it AUKUS. I mean, there's the AUKUS, and I call it AUKUS just because it's always easier to say an acronym than spell it out. So there's been a lot of like what I would describe as the pulling of hair and gnashing of teeth surrounding this particular new, I don't want to call it an alliance, but new agreement, right? So basically September 2021, kind of out of nowhere, I think I was going to bed actually, and I saw on Twitter that there was going to be this big announcement in Australia about this new technology agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. But I didn't think that much of it. I woke up and voila, we have this new tech sharing agreement, which is nominally about submarines, right? The story here is, of course, that Australia was interested in, or is interested in, having nuclear submarines or some kind of submarine because of all the issues we've actually been talking about with regards to the Asia Pacific. And they had an agreement with France to build submarines, and that was apparently not going well, at least in the eyes of the Australians. Partially, I don't know specifically why. If you read some of the accounts, it's apparently the French 2-hour lunch and 6 weeks holidays did not work very well with the Australian culture, and there was some concerns about delays to the projects and things like this. And there had so I believe the UK helped broker this agreement between the United States and Australia. And of course, if we thought things were bad here in France, it was just met with like a crazy amount of outrage that this agreement came together and was basically being pulled apart, or that had been sabotaged by the Brits, and tensions between the Brits and the French were pretty bad for some time. But in Canada, it's kind of, we view this, I think, through the Five Eyes, right? The Five Eyes being the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and of course, Canada. And it's an intelligence sharing agreement, but it has grown to be much more. It's a lot about security policy. It's about, various geostrategic understandings of the world. So it really has, sometimes they talk about the 5C, which is 5 country, as opposed to just 5 Eyes, because it has grown to so much more than just the intelligence. So to see 3 of our good friends kind of off in a corner talking about things and scheming and planning to go out, I don't know, on the weekend and kind of not invite us along, I think was met with a lot of concern here in Canada. So, Canada is a country of joiners. We like to join in on things, and for us to not be there was an issue. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So, see here, sorry. So basically, I mean, before we kind of all lost our minds, I thought it might be worth discussing, like, does it actually make sense for us to be in this security arrangement? Canada really hasn't been a part of the Asia Pacific in a security way in a very, very long time. We haven't been a part of a security alliance there since 1945. And then the second thing is, like, when we think about security issues, Canada's always looked west and not east. Which kind of doesn't make sense because of our coast. But in the sense, we always look to Europe. And if you look at kind of the way that Ukraine is dominating our security conversations right now, you can see why that is. But we usually think in terms of NATO. We think in terms of European alliances and things like this. We don't really think in terms of the Asia Pacific. And that's an issue, right? Some people point out that Beijing is actually much closer to Canada than it is Australia. Not in a threat sense, but in the sense of, we just don't really think of Asia as being close or relevant to our security concerns. And so I think that might explain it as well, even though we have a giant West Coast. So you go figure. We have issues with procurement. So, I mean, if this is a sub-agreement, I mean, just look at all the challenges we've had. I mean, credit to Minister Anand, who seems to be slowly working through some of these issues, hopefully making some improvements. Hey, we're going to get planes. That's fun. But, we don't seem to be able to even procure the technologies that we need. So, if you kind of want to go ahead with a particular project, does it actually make sense to keep Canada in those conversations? And finally, and I don't know the extent that this got some considerations, but basically proliferation issues. The fact if we did get nuclear submarines that, Canada's a part of various nuclear agreements, does that actually kind of throw some of that into jeopardy? So there was some of those concerns as well. Next slide, please. So what I have here, though, is some of the concerns about this particular agreement. When myself and Tomaj, we've gone down and we've been interviewing people here in Canada about the intelligence community. We went to the United States and interviewed both Canadians and Americans down there, and we have also spoken to some of our other intelligence sharing allies. And basically, we did note in our book that the 3 Eyes trend is real. Like, the fact is that Australia, the United States and Australia, United States, and the United Kingdom, they're all very active. They're all contributing to the conversation. They're bringing tactical intelligence, but it's not just what they share. They also, give their views. They're participating actively in meetings, and then as well that they are, the other thing is too is Australia is much more present in the United States than Canada is. Like Australia has like multiple representatives embedded in the Department of Defense and all the various national security institutions because they're there, they want to be there. And what we would often hear from people in Washington was that Canadians just didn't travel down there. We don't have as many people embedded. It was hard. Even though you could do that, or pre-COVID, you could do the trip in a day. It became, this is something that ministers just don't do, or not just ministers, but high-level officials or even working-level officials. We tend to take the relationship for granted. So in this sense, we're kind of more of a wallflower in this relationship than say Australia is. So we see our three allies going forward. And the reasons for this are a couple. So geopolitically, we live in a safe neighborhood. I think that's one of it. Secondly, Canada does not, again, we don't invest in that relationship that we have. We're not well represented. The fourth thing I would add there is we don't have a foreign policy. I mean, we're a G7 country that doesn't have a foreign policy. And no one in Canada seems to think that this is that much of I think this crowd excluded. But I mean, a lot of people don't seem to think this is a problem. And, I've been in meetings where I said, shouldn't we have a foreign policy to signal to our allies what our intentions actually are? And I've been laughed at. Good luck convincing a DM to have a foreign policy because our allies might want to see what we're thinking. And I'm like, no, really, that's why you have a foreign policy, right? It doesn't just set your domestic priorities, but it also sends an important signal to your allies what their goals are, so they can try to align interests. And this is really fundamentally important, but no one seems to care. And then, we could go into the Asia Pacific policy, this long promised document. Apparently it's written. I don't know if it's on a shelf somewhere at Global Affairs. Maybe it's not liked. I don't know. But the fact is we really struggle to put these things out. And then finally, we just don't have a strong intelligence and national security culture. And that's, again, we're a safe neighborhood. That's a blessing in this country. And we're really particularly lucky for that. But it means that as national security threats are changing, this is becoming really hard. And AUKUS is the consequence of that. So next slide, and I'll finish up. So what should Canada actually do, which is actually the point of this panel? So we actually need foreign policy. This is I don't know how to put it any more simple than that. Like this idea that we can keep skating, that we can just be this kind of reactionary country, it doesn't make sense. It's not good for us. And we need to actually set goals, and we need to actually have policies that our allies can look at and understand what our priorities are. We need to invest in our presence overseas. We really... there's that famous expression, half of life is showing up. We need to show up. We're not showing up, right? This includes at meetings. This includes diplomatically. We need to have a more robust presence in the Asia Pacific. We need to address our procurement issues. I mean, the good news is, I think, again, with Ukraine, the Ukraine conflict seems to have created a policy window where that's happening. Fourth, there's technology policy. Between 5G and beyond, we can't see technology now as a domestic issue. It's very much an international issue. And I think one of the key concerns I have here is that as we're seeing this AUKUS relationship develop, it's not just about subs. It's now, expanded to include technology agreements and technology sharing and all these kinds of things. In Canada, if we're going to stay in the Five Eyes, we're going to become a rule taker and not a rule maker, right? Like our three, if we want to continue getting good intelligence from our allies, they're going to expect us to have the same ideas about technology. But if we're not present in those conversations, this is going to be a huge issue. So technology has to be a part of this as well. And it's just interesting in the way a lot of these non-traditional areas are now very much in foreign policy. And finally, we need to contribute to international discussions. We need to say what our policies are. 2 weeks ago, Canada released its view on what international law is on cyber issues and conflict and cyber policy generally. That's great, but it's about 10 years too late. This is something we should have released 5-10 years ago. Baby steps, that's good. So I'm not going to slam it too much, but we need to be putting out policy statements. We need to be saying these things in forums. And if you talk to, people at Global Affairs, they'll say, yeah, we're saying things all the time. But a lot of the times, a lot of the stuff what we're saying is, we have a feminist foreign policy and that's great. But then we don't say what that then means and what the implications of that are, right? We need to take that to the next level and really kind of start putting some of our our ideas out there. I think there's a lot of smart people in government. We could do this. We just gotta try. So I'll stop there because I think I have 1 minute left. Actually, maybe over less than 1 minute, but those are my thoughts. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to hearing Mr. Newman speak. This is great.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And now we will have Don Newman with his presentation. Don Newman began his career at CTV, where he served as the network's Washington correspondent from 1972 to 1976. After CTV, he moved to CBC and served in Washington for 2 years. He was the host of CBC's This Week in Parliament from 1981 to 1983. He also anchored major political events that affected Canadians on CBC News World and anchored coverage of it from the Canadian Embassy in Washington during major political events in the United States. Newman was honored with the Charles Lynch Award for his outstanding coverage of national issues in 1988, and he became a member of the Order of Canada in 1999. On June 19, 2009, he made his final politics broadcast and retired from CBC at the end of that month. Don Newman, you have the stage.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be on a panel with Stephanie. I took a lot of notes because I always learn a lot from Stephanie, and now I'm going to regurgitate them back. But I'm not going to completely agree with everything she said, but by and large, I am. AUKUS, and I agree that's the right name for it. AUKUS it caused a big flap when it was announced in the middle of the election campaign, which is probably one reason that did cause a big flap. But it is actually about nuclear submarines, and it is actually about the South Pacific and about the East China Sea. And it's about the Americans wanting more backup in that area. They don't want to have every submarine. They want other people to pay for them. And it's also a long-term program because the first Australian submarines won't come on station until 2040. And in the meantime, they're going to rent a couple from the British, which won't be the newest, but at least they'll be nuclear submarines. At the time, Prime Minister Trudeau said, we're not interested in nuclear submarines. But the fact is, there is a plan. It may not come to any fruition, but there is a plan to stand up a program for nuclear submarines, gurgitating in the Department of Defense and in the Navy. But as Stephanie pointed out, we have such a disgraceful procurement program that they may never show up. I share with her the hope that we're going to have some airplanes now. Those airplanes were first discussed and approved by a Liberal government in 1997. They were dismissed entirely in 2015 by a Liberal Prime Minister, and now here in 2022, they're apparently back on the scene. But they haven't been delivered yet. They haven't been built yet, and who knows when they will actually shape up and show up. The other thing that we have, which is again, in a way, aimed towards the Asia and the Pacific, is this surface ship combatant program, where we're replacing old destroyers and old frigates with 15 new single type ships, which are neither a frigate nor a destroyer, but we don't know exactly what they are because none of them have been built yet. They were approved in 2012. And the cost was then to be about 60 billion for all of the ships. Now it's up to 80 billion, and we haven't even built one. So I've always wondered, and maybe Stephanie, you can explain to me sometime, how the cost keeps going up when we're not even building them. But apparently the cost goes up just by thinking about building them. They have committed to laying the hulls of 3 of them, but so far they haven't even done that. I don't think that it's a bad thing necessarily, or that we should panic that we are not in AUKUS. It was aimed at a specific area of the globe. We are not adjacent to that area. We're not in that area. Where we are important and where we have an alliance with the United States, and it's a lot older than AUKUS, it goes back to the 50s, is NORAD. And NORAD, the last time it was improved was in the 1980s. Now we are committed with the Americans to upgrading and improving NORAD. And there's some talk that there may be submarines used in that because NORAD allegedly protects, and I guess it did for a while, the northern approaches to North America, mainly to protect us from the Soviet Union. And the Arctic Ocean and under the ice in the Arctic Ocean, which may not be there all that much longer, but for the moment is still there. We need submarines, and we need probably nuclear submarines. It's hard to keep popping up in the Arctic Ocean and refueling because there aren't very many places to refuel, even if you do build one or two bases. So nuclear submarines can basically sail around the world without refueling. So we may end up yet with nuclear submarines, and they may end up in the Arctic Ocean, and then they can go wherever else we want to dispatch them. But if the Australians are waiting to 2040 to get them, I don't think ours are going to be ready till at least, I don't know, 10 or 15 years after that. So don't look forward to a ride on a nuclear submarine anytime in the near future, unless you're really young and maybe can live long enough for them to appear. The other thing that I think that is important is, and I agree with Stephanie, we have to get our act together, not just in procurement, but in actually what we're trying to do. We have been involved with the Americans, basically through NORAD and through NATO, for years and years and years, but it hasn't really changed anything very much. We got a defense sharing agreement with the Americans in the 1950s, which made us, among other things, able to make a lot of money in the Vietnam War because we supplied a lot of equipment to Vietnam, or to the Americans in Vietnam. It wasn't widely known in Canada, but the contractors were so integrated. So we've been tied to the Americans that way. We also have quite a few Canadian officers serving in the American Armed Forces, and particularly serving, I don't know if they're saving or not, but they're serving, and they're serving in the command headquarters. For instance, in Tampa Bay, there is the Southern Command is the U.S. Location there. It's located there, and it was planning the Iraq War. And when we decided, when Prime Minister Chrétien decided we weren't going to Iraq, mainly because he saw a debate on TV during a Quebec election where all of the leaders were wearing no war in Iraq, he decided that it wasn't safe for him to go there. The Canadian officers who were working on the plans for the Iraq War had to step aside. And so we've been tied into the Americans for a long time. And I don't think we have to worry about somehow being shunned and dropped by the Americans. As I understand it, Stephanie, and maybe you have other information, the Asia plan, the new Asia plan, is more or less completed. But there's a reluctance in the government to make it well known. And last I heard, they were going to kind of leak it out in dribs and drabs. And then after a while, it became apparent that, well, actually, all of these pieces kind of fit together. And I guess that's the new Asia-Pacific plan for Canada, that we're not going to try and confront the Chinese and say, well, here we are, this is the plan. And if you don't like it, well, you can lump it. And I think what is also happening with Huawei, which is, again, the Five Eyes, we are the only country in the Five Eyes that hasn't embraced the ban Huawei from our telephone systems because we think they can use it to either subvert them or for spying. But we're not going to actually announce that. And what is really happening, and was almost done, is Canadian telecom companies, without the go-ahead to use Huawei, have moved to other providers like Ericsson in Scandinavia and so forth. And basically, we've just excluded Huawei by not approving it. But we're not going to actually physically announce that we are going to exclude it. I think that that's kind of, you could argue that's really clever, and we didn't make anybody mad, although the Chinese must know what we're doing. They're not stupid. But it's kind of a bit duplicitous too, and I'm not sure that we shouldn't stand up and say, no, we don't agree with the way the Chinese are behaving. We think that they're going to use their technology to spy on us, and we're not going to use their technology. I think that that would make us feel a lot better about ourselves, and I think that our allies would feel a lot better about us. And I think that at that point, maybe we would also then stand a little taller and acquire some of this military equipment that we need and take part more in the operation and the planning of these different things that we basically are almost on the sidelines. And I think it's a very sad way to be. I think that we have a proud history and a proud tradition in Canada. In the two world wars, we pulled way beyond our weight. And I don't know now why we have, well, I do know why, and it's politics. The politics in the 1980s, 1970s, and 80s really shifted. And the NDP in particular they wanted us to drop out of NATO. Now they're singing the praises of NATO in Ukraine, but they weren't singing the praises at all of NATO then. And they wanted us to drop out of NATO. And Pierre Trudeau wasn't all that sure that they were wrong. And he, in 1970, there were 10,000 Canadian troops serving in Europe. And in 1970, he reduced them to 5,000. So that didn't really make the Europeans feel that we were great allies, or the Americans. And I think that that kind of reputation has stayed with us ever since. But in terms of AUKUS, I think we're going to have NATO. I think that if AUKUS moves north and becomes all of the Asia-Pacific area, if Japan is somehow moved into it, I think we may move into it yet. But I don't think at the moment that we are into it, and I don't think it really matters. I think we have enough fish to fry with the Americans, certainly in NORAD and certainly in NATO. And so for being excluded from AUKUS, I don't think is bad. I think they didn't tell us, and they didn't tell a lot of countries, including the French, because they didn't want it to leak. And they knew that anybody who was left out would be mad and would immediately leak it. And they didn't trust us enough to whisper under the covers that it was going to happen. But certainly the French were really mad when they lost the submarine contract. And we didn't lose anything really, except if we thought our faces were red for a day or so. But I think that we've got a lot to do without AUKUS, and we should get on with doing that.
Thank you very much. And I think now we can move to the question period. And so I think we have a few questions already. And if everyone else has questions, you feel free to type them in the chat. And it can be to like one specific speaker or both. And so I think the first one was for Dr. Stephanie Carvin. Has Canada ever been a rule maker? Hasn't Canada always been a rule taker?
That's a really good question. I actually would disagree. I think we as a middle power, or whatever we want to call ourselves, we've actually historically been able to punch above our weight in a number of areas, particularly kind of humanitarian ones. You could just look at peacekeeping. You could look at the Ottawa landmine ban. You could look at the Responsibility to Protect, right? That was a Canadian funded initiative that we put together. Now you could say that was a disaster or whatever, but we were putting ideas out there. And so like, I'm not saying it's always great, but I mean, at least we're trying. And I think, just putting ideas out there in terms of how to solve, and just to kind of echo, I think, I just want to echo Don Newman's point there that I think I agree with him. Like AUKUS doesn't matter. But it is the key point about AUKUS is that it's symptomatic of a larger trend in Canadian foreign policy, that we're not doing the kinds of things that we need to be doing. We're not taking it seriously. I hadn't heard that about the Asia Pacific policy that is going to come out in drips and drabs. I think that's regrettable if that is the case. With regards to the Huawei decision, the problem is it's not a Huawei decision. The government is trying to generate a 5G policy generally, because I think if they just ban Huawei, it'll probably fail just strictly on administrative law grounds. But if you have like an actual 5G policy, so that's the problem. They're trying to come up with it's a much more complex process. So that is still happening. But I mean, again, like it sounds bad when the government says, yes, we have this impending policy coming out, and then 5 years later, it's still not there. That's just ridiculous. And it's just not just ridiculous domestically, but also internationally as well.
Thank you very much. And I think also on the topic of the Asian Pacific policy, so Mr. Don Newman did mention like that the government was apparently planning to leak it in certain parts. But why do you think it hasn't been released yet, or that it sort of disappeared for a while, regardless of what will happen next?
Is that for me?
For both of you, if you would like.
Well, let me go first, Stephanie. I won't be polite at the moment. I think that a number of things happened. I think that the government got really frustrated and didn't know how to move for a long time on the two Michaels difficulties, with Michael Spavor and Michael Kovic being held in China in retaliation for the financial officer of Huawei being held here on an American warrant, but to be shipped to the United States. And in that way, all China policy kind of went into hiatus. Nobody wanted to do anything that could in any way endanger the Michaels, but nobody wanted to do anything that would look like we were giving in. And the Chinese kind of understood that too. They took a long time to bring them to trial, and then they brought them to trial, and then they found them guilty, and then they didn't sentence them, and then they sentenced one of them. And all the time we were working, particularly with our ambassador, our second ambassador there, Dominic Martin, who then went to Washington and kind of brokered the deal between the Americans and the Chinese to make Meng Wanzhou go and let her go home. And then lo and behold, the Michaels came home. So I think we went into a kind of turtle pose with the two Michaels, and that to some degree held up everything to do with China, because nobody wanted to risk their safety and what might happen to them.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Carvin, do you have anything to add?
No, I would just talk. I think this government has a hard time making, well, it doesn't pass a lot of legislation. I think it has a hard time wanting to actually take action. It doesn't seem to want to make decisions. It doesn't seem to want to make choices. It kind of just wants to be liked by everybody. And so I think this might be one reason why that's the case.
Well, it's also true that there's very few people around that cabinet table who seem to have any interest in foreign policy or defense policy. The only one, and he never made it to the cabinet, was Andrew, whatever his name is, who didn't make it.
Andrew Leslie?
Andrew Leslie. And I don't.
I mean, they had Ralph Goodale, who I think was an excellent minister of public safety and did bring about like the greatest reforms of our national security architecture. He did a good job. I think Minister Anand, I think, will prove herself to be good. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but like I also like. Yeah, but I think like the people who do care about foreign policy don't tend to be in cabinet. So
No.
the Toronto MP, John McKay? It might actually be John McKay. There's a number of MPs. And like I said, we did see a large number of Liberal MPs out at the Taiwan night here in Ottawa last night, which is interesting, right? Which we may not have seen that like 4 or 5 years ago, but we're seeing it now. So I don't know if there's like more interest at the MP level, where we've also seen, the fact that you have they're willing to vote against cabinet on issues like China, like the genocide of Xinjiang and things like this. So it's just interesting that cabinets in particular seems to be really, really reluctant to do things. But MPs, I think, are more ambitious in this area.
Well, I think it's symptomatic of the Trudeau government that we have a feminist foreign policy. And I'm not quite sure, except we have a woman as foreign minister, which is fine, good, overdue probably. What is a feminist foreign policy?
Well, it's just that they've never defined it, right? They've never said what it is, and that's my. I'm like, great. I'm not against it at all, but like, what is it? Like.
Well, I don't know if I'm for it or against it because they haven't told me what it is.
What it is yet.
but I like Melanie Joly. But it's if that's what a feminist foreign policy is, it's not very deep.
Thank you so much for your answers. And I think we have 2 more questions. So if this is for Mr. Newman, if AUKUS is not right for Canada, is it time to start looking at other types of agreements or groupings in the Indo-Pacific? Should we work more with non-traditional security partners, such as Japan?
I don't, AUKUS may become right for Canada, as I said, if they move it more up to take in all of the Pacific, and if a country like Japan were in it, I think we should join it too, and I think that we would be with Japan. And I think in the end, the traditional security partners are going to be who we rely on, and we need to be relied on by them. And I think, as Stephanie said, we have to give them lots of strength to believe that we can be relied on. And I think we can. I don't think Canadians can't be relied on, but it would be good if we had some modern equipment that actually worked and that could show up and provide the support that they are looking for. And it would be good if we had enough people in the armed services that when they're called upon, they can show up.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think this question could go to both of you, since I think we both talked about it, so the question is, how does Canadian law catch up with technologies that telecom companies have that contribute to the spying of Canadians?
So this is something I want to say full line. The idea that banning Huawei will make Canada safer is a giant myth, and we need to dispel that, right? All technologies have vulnerabilities. China doesn't need Huawei to spy on Canada. China is spying on us right now, and it's doing so with non-Chinese companies because of the security vulnerabilities that are out there, right? So I think that there's a false security with regards to this idea. The problem with Huawei is that it engages in anti-competitive practices. It's trying to have a monopoly of technology, and it's doing so through large amounts of aid to these companies, whether it's theft of intellectual property, whether it's just economic support so that it can basically thrash any of the other competition out there. Basically wants to create market dominance. That's the security challenge of Huawei, is that it's trying to create a monopoly. And yes, it's bad. So because we'd be dependent on China for a lot of our security and like the technology that we use in everyday communications. Yes, it would be more vulnerable to a lot of the there would be security vulnerabilities, but partially it would be because competition encourages good security practices, right? And so if you have few companies out there that can actually produce 5G and now 6G equipment, then the challenge is that they will not put in good practices because there's no incentive to do so. So I think this is one of the things that, we have to look at Huawei as an economic national security challenge, not as much as a cybersecurity challenge. I think that line is played way too much, given all of the challenges we have just with normal non-Chinese technology. So that being said, how does Canada law? We need so Huawei's the beginning. It's not the end of the conversation. It's just this is just the very beginning. We need to have set policies for how do we feel about foreign companies coming in and buying reams of data, or like companies that have reams of data about Canadians, whether it's biometric, whether it's patterns of life, whether it's credit spending, all these different kinds of things, and then bringing that back to their country where security services can knit that together using some fairly sophisticated algorithms. How do we feel about companies that engage in facial recognition, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these kinds of things? So we need basically policies that kind of look at platforms that can be like, okay, well, if companies are doing X kinds or class of activities, then this is where we can come in and step and regulate. Last point I'll make here, sorry, because I rant about this, but I don't think people appreciate the extent to which the Investment Canada Act is actually our most sophisticated national security tool. It really, really is. It's actually in some ways more powerful than a warrant because there's very little oversight other than, I guess, you can sue the government if you're denied. It is a black box. Those conversations do not take place publicly. And right now, it's a lot of our national security actually depends on it. But what we actually need, we don't need a Huawei ban. We need a policy writ large with regards to telecommunications technologies. And that's how we keep up. Sorry, big rant over.
Well, I agree with Stephanie about the foreign investment review. I think that's it's kind of like the Star Chamber. You go in and you never know what's going on until they tell you. But the thing about Huawei is they don't have the opportunity just to spy on Canada. And the reason why we'd probably get kicked out of the Five Eyes is that they do have at least some access to the information of all the other countries in the Five Eyes, and Australia and Britain and the United States, and the United States in particular, they'd probably be more interested in that than they would be in Canada. And the other thing about SOEs, state-owned enterprises, in China, they all are, they work for the government. And if the government tells them to do something, they have to do it. And that's the way they survive. And that if the government tells them to listen in on when the president talks to the prime minister, they'll do it, and then they'll report back. Now, they might not learn anything. It may be banal, but the possibility is there. And that's why the other countries have banned it, and that's why we're going to ban it too.
Thank you so much for your answers. And I think we have another question for both of you. Again, how do we address the challenge posed by companies based in regimes that force cooperation with intelligence agencies, such as in China? How can we treat these companies as trusted?
Well, let me go first, Stephanie, this time. I don't think we can. And I think that we have to do what we're going to do with Huawei, and we're basically doing with them now. You have to treat them as though they're agents of the state, because they are. They may not be formally agents of the state, but they all are. And that's why it's not the only reason they have them, but it's one way they have them. And, China is really a surveillance society. And I'm sure Huawei knows how to listen in on every conversation of all 1.6 billion Chinese. And they can probably listen in on your conversation and mine too. So I think you have to treat them that way. You just have to say, that's what they are. They can say they're not, but we don't believe them. And we're not going to fall for that old trick.
So the way I tend to think about these companies is you have in Canada, you have in China, state-owned enterprises, which now comprise something like a quarter of if not more, of all Chinese businesses. But also you have state-championed enterprises, right? Like Huawei. Huawei is a classic example, right? And yes, as Donovan said, you can absolutely have the Chinese state can actually order companies to do things. That's part of their national security laws, and that's something we always have to take into consideration. I think you have to kind of go in, I always say, eyes wide open with regards to this. I mean, the ICA process can take all of this into consideration, but the fact is, it's also a bit of a moving target. Like if 2017, 2018, if you said, is it a problem if Chinese state-owned enterprise decides to start purchasing as an investment Canadian retirement homes? Probably not, but in a post-pandemic Canada, we might look at that a little bit differently, right? So that goalpost is always changing. And so I think it has to be context specific. And I think it also has to be, this is why it can take up to almost a full year, I think up to 200 days in order for a cabinet to actually make its decision when it comes to some of these more complex decisions when it comes to foreign investment in Canada.
Thank you so much for both of your answers. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. So if not, I guess we can start wrapping panel 3 up and the conference as well. Thank you again so much, Mr. Newman and Dr. Stephanie Carvin, for coming here and sharing your expertise and interacting with each other too. I think that was a great part of the panel. And yes, thank you so much. I think it's like you said earlier, Dr. Carvin, that discussing China and Canada's role is like even more important now, even with the ongoing developments in Russia, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also as we've seen in the conference, that it is actually relevant too, right? We mentioned, Taiwan multiple times in relation with, the situation there. So thank you all so much for taking the time to discuss this really important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.